There is a study somewhere, and if you have ever spent time in a real archive, you will recognize it immediately. The kind of room where the air smells faintly of old paper, and something older still, something you cannot name. The shelves run floor to ceiling. The folders are numbered, cross-referenced, annotated in at least 3 different handwriting styles. Because this material has passed through multiple hands over 8 decades. On the desk, there are photographs, maps with hand-drawn markings, transcripts of speeches, statistical reports from ministries that no longer exist, from a government that lasted exactly 12 years and killed more human beings in that span than most empires managed in centuries. I have been sitting with this material for a long time, and I want to be honest with you before we begin. I am not going to make this easy. I am not going to smooth this out into something comfortable, something that hums along in the background while you drift off to sleep, untroubled. That is not what this history deserves. What I am going to do is sit with you, the way a researcher sits with a difficult document, and work through it, piece by piece, year by year, decision by decision, because the only honest way to understand what the Third Reich was is to understand how it was built, not as mythology, not as a story of monsters who arrived from nowhere, but as a sequence of choices made by real people in real places for reasons that, and this is the part that should unsettle us, were not always difficult to understand. Before you press pause and walk away from that idea, stay with me. Understanding is not the same as justifying. A physician who studies a disease is not endorsing it. A historian who reconstructs a catastrophe is not celebrating it. What we are doing here, across 4 hours of documentary narration, is reconstruction. Careful forensic, occasionally heated reconstruction. There will be moments in this script where the historiographical record is genuinely contested, where serious scholars disagree about causes, about timing, about intention. And I will tell you when we reach those moments, because you deserve to know when the map becomes uncertain. Here is what we know with confidence. Between the 30th of January 1933 and the 8th of May 1945, a political system called the Third Reich, the so-called 1,000-year Reich, though it would not survive a single generation, controlled Germany, then large portions of Europe, and in doing so, reshaped the modern world in ways we are still living inside of. Roughly 6 million Jews were systematically murdered. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died across the entire conflict the Reich helped ignite. A number so large the human mind cannot process it honestly. Historians have spent 8 decades trying to answer a single question. How? Not how in the mechanical sense. The mechanics have been documented, archived, catalogued. How in the deeper sense? How does a modern, educated, culturally sophisticated nation, the country of Goethe, of Beethoven, of Albert Einstein, arrive at that destination? What were the steps? Where were the exits that were not taken? Where did individuals make choices? And where did systems make choices for them? That is what this documentary is. 4 hours, 15 chapters, no shortcuts. If you have been searching for the definitive long-form account, one that treats you as an adult capable of holding complexity without flinching, you have found it. Settle in, pour something warm. Open your mind the way you would open an archive box, because we start at the beginning, not 1933. The real beginning, the wreckage left behind by one war that made the next one possible. If you stay through all 15 chapters of this documentary, something will have changed in how you think about collective decision-making, political systems, and the architecture of catastrophe. That is not a small thing. Stay with it, subscribe if you have not already. The algorithm does not care about this kind of material. Only people who genuinely want to understand history keep channels like this alive. Share it with someone who reads. Chapter 1. The World Before the Monster. Germany and the Wound of Versailles, 1918 to 1923. Germany in November of 1918 did not look like a nation that would, within 15 years, become the engine of the most destructive conflict in human history. It looked, if anything, like a nation that had already been broken. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The imperial government, which had sent millions of young men into the mud of the Western Front across 4 years of industrial slaughter, had simply ceased to function. On the 11th of November 1918, an armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, France. The guns stopped, and Germany, vast, humiliated, starving under a British naval blockade that had been strangling its food supply, looked at the silence and did not know what to do with it. What followed was not peace. It was a suspended state of political emergency that went on for years. In the weeks immediately after the armistice, revolutionary councils, modelled loosely on the Soviet model that had taken Russia the previous year, appeared in major German cities. There was a very real possibility, in the winter of 1918 to 1919, that Germany would become a communist state. The Social Democrats, who had taken charge of the collapsing republic, suppressed these uprisings, using paramilitary units called Freikorps, veterans of the front who had no civilian identity and no patience for the democratic process. The Freikorps would be important later. Remember them. They are the violence that preceded the organized violence. Into this environment came the Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June, 1919. Historians still debate the treaty's actual terms versus how Germans perceived those terms. And this is a distinction that matters enormously. The treaty required Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war under the notorious War Guilt Clause, Article 231. It required reparations, a sum that was adjusted multiple times over subsequent years, but initially set at 132 billion gold marks, a figure almost no one in Germany in 1919 could conceptualize. It stripped Germany of roughly 13% of its pre-war territory, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, the Polish corridor to the newly reconstituted Poland, and the port city of Danzig, which became a free city under League of Nations supervision. Germany's military was capped at 100,000 men, a number roughly equivalent to a large police force for a nation of more than 60 million people. The Rhineland, the industrial heartland along Germany's western border, was demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops. Whether these terms were uniquely harsh by the standards of European peace settlements is debated by historians to this day. Some scholars point out that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the peace Germany itself imposed on Russia in March of 1918, was considerably more severe. Others argue that what mattered was not the objective terms, but the psychological experience of the terms. The sense that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but had been stabbed in the back by domestic enemies. That the Republic had surrendered when it could have fought on. This stab in the back mythology, the Dolchstoßlegende, was manufactured almost immediately after the armistice by military figures seeking to protect their own reputations. It was not true, but it was useful. It assigned blame to civilians, to social democrats, to Jews, to anyone who was not the uniformed officer corps who had actually managed the war and actually requested the armistice. The Dolchstoßlegende did not create the Nazis, but it prepared the soil for them. The Weimar Republic, named for the city in which its constitution was drafted in 1919, was a genuinely ambitious democratic experiment. Its constitution was, on paper, one of the most progressive in the world. It established universal suffrage, including women. It had a sophisticated proportional representation system. It had strong protections for civil liberties. It also had one critical structural flaw, which the legal scholar Carl Schmitt, who would later, with considerable moral compromise, align himself with the Nazis, identified precisely. Article 48 of the Weimar constitution permitted the president to rule by emergency decree in times of crisis. That clause was a door. Not everyone who used it in the 1920s was sinister, but it remained a door, and eventually someone walked through it who had very different intentions. The years between 1919 and 1923 were defined by a sequence of overlapping crises that would have tested any new democracy. Political violence was endemic. Leading politicians were assassinated, including Matthias Erzberger, who had signed the armistice, and Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister, both murdered by right-wing extremists in the early 1920s. There were coup attempts from the left and the right. In 1923, when Germany defaulted on reparations payments, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr industrial region, the country's productive heartland. In January of that year, the German government responded by encouraging passive resistance, which it funded by printing money. The resulting hyperinflation became legendary. By November of 1923, the exchange rate had reached approximately 4 trillion marks to $1. People carried banknotes in wheelbarrows. Middle-class savings accumulated over decades evaporated. The psychological damage done by that hyperinflation, the sense that the economic floor could simply disappear beneath you, never fully healed in Germany. It would resurface as a political fear throughout the 1930s and beyond. It was in this atmosphere, 1919, Munich, Bavaria, a city seething with political clubs, veterans' organizations, and conspiracies of every ideological flavor, that a 30-year-old Austrian-born former corporal attended a meeting of a small political group called the German Workers' Party. The man was Adolf Hitler. He had fought on the Western Front, had been temporarily blinded in a mustard gas attack near Ypres in October of 1918, had recovered in a military hospital in Passwalk in Prussia where, by his own later account, he received news of the armistice as a catastrophe inflicted on Germany by internal enemies. He was unemployed, stateless in a practical sense, angry in a way that felt focused only when he was speaking. His superiors in the German military, where he was then employed as a political education officer tasked with monitoring radical groups, noticed that he could hold a crowd. This was, on reflection, the most consequential thing anyone noticed about anyone in the 20th century. In September of 1919, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, not as an infiltrator, as he was initially tasked, but as a convert. He had found his vehicle. The party was tiny, fewer than 60 members when he joined. Within 2 years, he had reorganized it, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the NSDAP, which became the Nazi Party through the abbreviation of its first syllable, and had made himself its undisputed leader. The party had a newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, which it purchased in December of 1920. It had a paramilitary arm, the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the Stormtroopers, the Brown Shirts, organized in 1921, and it had a 25-point program that combined economic populism, extreme nationalism, and virulent anti-Semitism in proportions specifically calculated to appeal to Germans who felt betrayed, humiliated, and economically ruined. On the 8th and 9th of November, 1923, Hitler made his first attempt to seize power directly. The Beer Hall Putsch, named for the Bürgerbräukeller in Munich, where the attempt began, was modelled on Mussolini's march on Rome the previous year. Hitler, with the assistance of the World War I General Erich Ludendorff, attempted to use a mass rally as the launching point for a march on Berlin that would force the Bavarian and then the national government to surrender power. It failed almost immediately. The Bavarian state police, standing in a narrow street in central Munich on the morning of the 9th of November, opened fire. 16 putschists and 4 policemen died. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in prison at Landsberg Fortress. He served 9 months. During that time, he dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf, My Struggle, to his deputy, Rudolf Hess. It sold modestly when published in 1925. Few people outside Bavaria read it carefully. Fewer still absorbed what it actually said about what Hitler intended to do if he ever held real power. The failure at Munich in 1923 was, in retrospect, the hinge point that should concern us most in this opening chapter, because Hitler drew from it a lesson that would define the entire subsequent strategy of the Nazi movement. Direct seizure of power through force had failed. The path to power would run through elections, through legal manipulation, through the existing institutions of democracy turned against themselves. This decision to work inside the system, rather than overthrow it directly, would make Hitler both more dangerous and, for a critical period, more difficult to identify as a threat. He was not a revolutionary with a gun in his hand. He was a politician with a ballot box, and the Weimar Republic had just enough structural fragility, just enough Article 48, just enough proportional representation chaos, just enough economic precarity to make that ballot box into a weapon. Chapter 2. The Quiet Years and the Coming Storm. Weimar's Brief Flourishing, 1924 to 1929. Here is the part of the story that is almost always compressed too quickly because it is less cinematically dramatic than what came before and after. The years between 1924 and 1929 were not peaceful in Germany. Political violence never entirely disappeared, but they were genuinely, surprisingly stable by the standards of what had come before. Understanding this stability is not a footnote. It is essential, because if you do not understand that Germany had a functioning, modernizing democracy in these years, you cannot understand how remarkable, how genuinely disturbing the collapse of that democracy was between 1930 and 1933. The Weimar Republic did not fail because it was always weak. It failed when it was struck by a force it was not designed to withstand. The stabilization began with the Rentenmark, introduced in November of 1923. The same month as the failed putsch, it was a new currency backed not by gold reserves Germany did not have, but by a mortgage on German land and industrial assets. It was, on its face, a financial fiction, and the economists who designed it knew it. But the fiction worked because economic confidence is partly a collective psychology, and Germany's population desperately wanted to believe the hyperinflation was over. The Rentenmark held. Within months, prices stabilized. Businesses reopened. People began to spend again. Then, in August of 1924, the Dawes Plan, named for the American banker Charles Dawes, restructured German reparations payments on a sliding scale and, crucially, arranged for substantial American loans to flow into the German economy. Between 1924 and 1929, American banks lent Germany roughly $2.5 billion, which Germany used to pay reparations to France and Britain, who in turn used the money to pay their war debts to the United States. It was a circular arrangement, and it was dependent on one thing remaining stable: American willingness to keep lending. In the cultural realm, the Weimar years produced an explosion of artistic and intellectual energy that still resonates. Berlin in the mid-1920s was one of the most sophisticated cities on earth. The Bauhaus School was redesigning the visual language of the modern world from its base in Dessau. Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill were writing plays and music that argued with themselves and with their audience simultaneously. The cabaret culture, the political satire, the sexual ambiguity, the deliberate transgression of Wilhelmine respectability attracted artists and intellectuals from across Europe and from America. This is the Weimar that the photographs remember most vividly: the flapper dresses, the jazz clubs, the experimental cinema. It was real, and it coexisted in the same cities, in the same years, with raw poverty, crippling unemployment in certain sectors, and a political culture that remained deeply fragile beneath the surface shine. The Nazi Party, during these years, was politically marginal. In the Reichstag elections of May 1928, the NSDAP received 2.5% of the national vote, winning 12 seats in a parliament of 491. Hitler was not taken seriously by most of Germany's political establishment in 1928. Conservative politicians, military figures, and industrialists noted his existence. Some of them had begun funding him cautiously. But the dominant view was that he was a Bavarian eccentric, useful perhaps as a noisy right-wing agitator who could be controlled if he ever became genuinely necessary. This was, as political miscalculations go, an almost perfect one. They believed they could use him. They were mistaken about which direction the use would run. What the Nazi movement did during the quiet years was organize. This is the part of the story that is technically unglamorous, but historically decisive. The party built a network of local chapters, GAU, across Germany, each with its own regional leadership, its own propaganda operation, its own social programs for members. The SA continued to grow, holding rallies, intimidating opponents, projecting the image of disciplined force. Joseph Goebbels, who joined the party in the mid-1920s and quickly became one of its most gifted propagandists, built a communications operation that, by the standards of the era, was sophisticated in its targeting. The party understood, before most democratic parties understood, that political advertising worked differently for different audiences, and it tailored its messages accordingly. Farmers in the north received different literature from workers in the Ruhr. Small business owners heard different arguments from university students. The core message, German humiliation, Jewish conspiracy, national renewal, remained constant, but its packaging was calibrated. The historian Richard Evans, in his authoritative trilogy on the Third Reich, makes a point that bears repeating here. The Nazis did not win power primarily because of their ideology. They won power primarily because of their organization. No other party in Germany in the late 1920s and early 30s had built anything comparable. A mass movement with genuine grassroots presence, capable of mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people in disciplined public demonstrations. The Social Democrats had trade union infrastructure. The Communists had ideological fervor, but neither had the Nazi combination of mass rally spectacle, street-level intimidation, and organizational density. When the economic crisis arrived, and it was coming, though almost no one in 1928 knew how bad it would be, the Nazis were positioned to move faster than any other political force. They had spent 5 years building the infrastructure of a takeover. The calm had been a construction period. In October of 1929, two things happened within days of each other that together ended the Weimar Republic's period of relative stability. On the 3rd of October, Gustav Stresemann, the foreign minister who had, more than any other single individual, stabilized the Republic's international position and negotiated the Locarno Treaties of 1925 that had normalized Germany's position in Europe, died of a stroke. He was 51 years old. Germany's most capable democratic statesman was gone at the precise moment he was most needed. 4 weeks later, on the 24th of October, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The American loans stopped. The circular system of reparations and debt repayment froze. Germany, which had built its recovery on borrowed American confidence, was about to discover what it looked like when the confidence ran out. The Great Depression hit Germany with a severity that is difficult to overstate in retrospect. By the winter of 1930 to 1931, unemployment in Germany had exceeded 4 million. By January of 1932, it had passed 6 million, and that figure, contested at the time as potentially an undercount, represented roughly 1 in 3 of the German workforce. Men who had fought in the war, had rebuilt their lives, had perhaps owned a small business or held a trade, found themselves with nothing. The social safety net was not adequate for numbers on this scale. Municipal governments could not pay their welfare obligations. Banks began to fail. The Weimar coalition governments, and there were several in rapid succession, each one less stable than the last, could not agree on whether to cut spending or increase it, and the resulting paralysis looked, to many Germans, like proof that parliamentary democracy was structurally incapable of handling a real crisis. What the Great Depression did, in political terms, was transform the Nazi Party from a marginal irritant into a mass movement in the space of roughly 2 years. In September of 1930, less than a year after the Wall Street crash, the NEDSTAP received 18% of the national vote in Reichstag elections, rising from 12 seats to 107. In July of 1932, they received 37%, the highest share they would ever achieve in a genuinely free election, and became the largest single party in the Reichstag, with 230 seats out of 608. These numbers still did not represent a majority. The Nazis never won an outright majority in a free vote, but they were now the dominant force in German parliamentary politics, and the question of what to do with them had become impossible to avoid. The answers that Weimar's political elite reached for, coalition maneuvering, presidential emergency decrees, the calculation that Hitler could be domesticated, were all wrong. Not obviously wrong, not wrong in ways that are easy to mock from a distance of nearly a century, but wrong in the deep sense that they misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. This was not a conventional right-wing party that would moderate in office. This was a movement built around the total transformation of the state. But in 1931, 1932, 1933, that distinction was not as visible from inside the political system as it is from outside it in retrospect. This is the hardest lesson of this entire chapter. The catastrophe did not announce itself clearly. It arrived wearing the clothes of recognizable politics. Chapter 3. The Seizure. How Democracy Handed Over the Keys, 1930 to 1933. There is a question that historians of Germany return to again and again, with something close to genuine frustration. Was the destruction of the Weimar Republic inevitable? The honest answer is no. There were multiple points at which different decisions could have produced different outcomes. This is not a comfortable thought, because it means we are not dealing with a force of historical nature, an earthquake, a flood, but with a sequence of human choices that could have gone otherwise. What makes this chapter difficult is not the material itself, but the responsibility it places on the individuals who made those choices. The political crisis of 1932 was a three-cornered struggle between the Nazis, the Social Democrats, and the conservative elite around President Paul von Hindenburg, the ancient field marshal, then 84 years old, who had commanded Germany's armies in the First World War, and who viewed Hitler personally with something between contempt and useful calculation. Hindenburg had already been governing Germany largely through emergency decree under Article 48 since 1930. Chancellors, first Heinrich Brüning, then Franz von Papen, then Kurt von Schleicher, without genuine parliamentary majorities, running the country as a form of presidential semi-dictatorship. Each of these chancellors attempted to stabilize Germany without giving Hitler power. Each of them failed. Brüning's austerity measures deepened the Depression's impact. Von Papen, who dissolved the Reichstag twice in 1932, found himself unable to build a stable coalition without the Nazis. Von Schleicher, the last Weimar chancellor, lasted 57 days. In November of 1932, something important happened that has been partially obscured by subsequent events. The Nazis lost votes. In the November Reichstag elections, the NSDAP fell from 230 seats to 196. Their percentage of the vote dropped from 37 to 33. The party's finances were under severe strain. The mass rallies were extraordinarily expensive to organize. Internal morale was shaky. Some historians argue, and the evidence is at least suggestive, that if the conservative elite around Hindenburg had held firm and refused to give Hitler the chancellorship, the Nazi electoral peak had already passed. The movement might have gradually contracted. This is speculative, and speculation about historical counterfactuals is slippery, but the November figures are real. They deserve to be acknowledged. Instead, on the 30th of January, 1933, President von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The decision was made by Hindenburg's son Oskar, by the former Chancellor Franz von Papen, who had convinced himself that Hitler could be managed from behind through conservative cabinet ministers, and by a circle of conservative nationalists, landowners, and industrialists who believed they were using the Nazi movement as a tool and would remain in control of it. Von Papen reportedly told a colleague that Hitler would be in his pocket within 2 months. The colleague's response is not recorded, but the subsequent 2 months rendered it moot. Von Papen had made the precise error that the conservative establishment had been making about Hitler since 1923. He confused volume with blindness. Hitler was loud. He was also watching everything. The cabinet that Hitler was handed on the 30th of January 1933 contained only 3 Nazis out of 12 ministers. The conservatives believed this was a structural safeguard. It lasted 4 weeks. On the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building in Berlin caught fire. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found at the scene and arrested. He was, by all available evidence, genuinely responsible for the fire, acting alone, though the Nazi government immediately and loudly claimed it was the opening move of a communist revolution. Whether any Nazi officials had prior knowledge of the fire, encouraged it, or exploited what they did not start remains one of the genuinely unresolved questions of the period. What is not unresolved is what happened next. The following morning, the 28th of February, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire Decree, die Verordnung des Reichspräsidenten zum Schutz von Volk und Staat, which suspended civil liberties, abolished freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the privacy of correspondence, and gave the Reich government authority to override state governments. It was signed as an emergency measure. It remained in force for the entire 12 years of the Third Reich. The elections held on the 5th of March, 1933, with the Reichstag Fire Decree in effect, with the Communist Party effectively suppressed, with SA men standing outside polling stations in their brown uniforms, gave the Nazis 43% of the vote. Not a majority. Still not a majority, even with the political climate of intimidation that surrounded the vote. But combined with their coalition partner, the German National People's Party, it was enough to form a parliamentary majority. The Nazis then moved immediately to make that majority permanent. On the 23rd of March, 1933, the Reichstag voted on the Enabling Act, the Ermächtigungsgesetz, which transferred legislative authority from the parliament to the cabinet, effectively to Hitler, for 4 years. The vote required a 2/3 supermajority. The Communist Party members had been arrested or had fled. The remaining Social Democrats voted against it, all 94 of them, standing in the Kroll Opera House, where the Reichstag had been relocated, while SA men lined the galleries above them. The vote passed 444 to 94. Germany's parliament had voted to make itself irrelevant. The Weimar Republic, which had begun with such democratic ambition in 1919, ended in a legislature of men who were afraid and some who were willing, and a political mechanism that allowed both kinds of compliance to produce the same result. The months between March and July of 1933 completed what the Enabling Act had begun. One by one, Germany's other political parties were dissolved or banned. The Social Democrats were banned outright on the 22nd of June, 1933. The Catholic Centre Party dissolved itself on the 5th of July. By the 14th of July, 1933, exactly 144 years after the storming of the Bastille, Germany was legally a one-party state. The speed is worth emphasizing. From Hitler's appointment as Chancellor to the legal establishment of a one-party dictatorship was approximately 5 months. That is not a gradual slide. It is a very fast process that was nonetheless, and this is the detail that matters, largely legal at each step. Each piece of legislation passed through whatever remained of the constitutional process. Each emergency measure cited genuine or manufactured emergencies. The apparatus of law was used to abolish the rule of law. Hannah Arendt would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately how that was possible. The trade unions were dissolved on the 2nd of May, 1933, 3 weeks before the Social Democrats themselves. Their assets were seized, their leaders arrested, and a Nazi organization called the German Labour Front was installed in their place. This was not an economic measure, it was a political one. The unions were the Social Democrats' organizational backbone, and destroying them first made the subsequent destruction of the party a foregone conclusion. The logic of the seizure of power was always sequential. Weaken the institutional supports before attacking the institution itself. The pattern recurred throughout the Nazi consolidation. Newspapers, professional associations, civic organizations, universities, all were either brought into alignment with the new state or dissolved. The German term was Gleichschaltung, meaning coordination or bringing into line. Every organization in German life was either a Nazi organization or it did not exist. There was no middle ground. By the summer of 1933, Adolf Hitler, the failed artist, the front soldier, the Bavarian putschist who had spent 9 months in prison, was the undisputed political master of Germany. He was not yet omnipotent. The army retained its independence. The President Hindenburg still lived, and several of the conservative ministers who had been installed to control him were still formally in their posts, still persuading themselves that real power remained with them. It did not, but the illusion mattered for a few more months, because maintaining the illusion cost Hitler nothing, and disposing of it openly would have cost him something. He was patient about timing in a way that his later military decisions would suggest he sometimes was not. The transformation of Germany between January and July of 1933 remains one of the most studied political processes in modern history, and the historiographical debate about its causes is genuinely unresolved in several dimensions. How much of the population actively supported the Nazi seizure of power? How many were coerced? How many were complicit through passivity? The German historian Robert Gellatley, in his work on the social history of the Third Reich, argues for a degree of popular complicity that many found uncomfortable when the research appeared. Others, including historians working from Gestapo records, have argued that the security state was effective precisely because it required relatively few actual enforcers. Most social control was exercised through neighbor informing on neighbor, colleague on colleague. This is not a comfortable finding, and I am not going to smooth over its implications. Social control at scale does not require a secret policeman on every corner. It requires enough uncertainty about who might be watching that people begin to police themselves. What 1933 demonstrated, and what remains its most disturbing legacy for any student of political institutions, is the speed at which a democracy can be hollowed out while its shell remains standing. The Reichstag building still existed. Elections were still occasionally held, though they were plebiscites rather than free votes. Ministers still sat in their offices, but the substance of democratic governance The ability to remove leaders through votes, to organize political opposition, to publish free journalism, was gone. The shell was preserved because it was useful. It provided legitimacy. It provided a facade of normality that made the day-to-day accommodation of Nazi rule easier for people who did not want to think too hard about what they were accommodating. This dynamic, the preservation of the appearance of normality in the service of profoundly abnormal political structures, is one of the things the Third Reich did most efficiently, and understanding it is essential to everything that follows in this documentary. Chapter 4, Consolidation, The Night of the Long Knives, and the Birth of the Führer State, 1933 to 1934. Having seized the machinery of the state, Hitler spent the next 18 months doing something that is often underestimated in its difficulty. He made the seizure permanent. This is not the same thing as taking power. Many coups and political upheavals take power. What is rare, what the Nazi leadership understood with unusual clarity, is that taking power and holding power are separate problems, requiring separate strategies. The first required speed and legal manipulation. The second required the systematic elimination of every conceivable challenge to the new order. What happened between July of 1933 and August of 1934 was the construction of what political scientists call an authoritarian equilibrium, a state of affairs in which the costs of resistance exceed the conceivable benefits, and in which all the institutions capable of organizing resistance have been either absorbed, neutralized, or destroyed. The most dangerous challenge to Hitler's authority in the summer of 1934 did not come from the left, which had been effectively suppressed. It came from within the Nazi movement itself. Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, Hitler's old comrade from the early Munich days, one of the very few people who addressed Hitler informally as Adolf rather than Mein Führer, had built the SA into a force of roughly 2 million members by 1934. Röhm wanted the SA to become the nucleus of a new revolutionary army, absorbing the existing German military, the Reichswehr, into a genuine people's army under his command. This was a genuine program, not merely a rhetorical position, and it put Röhm on a collision course with two powerful forces simultaneously. The German army's professional officer corps, who were appalled by the idea of being subordinated to SA street fighters, and Heinrich Himmler's SS, which had its own institutional ambitions that an all-powerful SA would obstruct. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, originally Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, had been growing quietly under Himmler's direction since 1929. By 1934, it was still smaller than the SA, but its organizational culture was different in a way that would prove decisive. It was built around absolute personal loyalty to Hitler, expressed through ritual, through ideological formation, and through careful selection. The SA was a mass movement of street-level roughness. The SS was something more structured, more selective, and more dangerous in the long term. Himmler and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich understood that the SA's bulk was its vulnerability. An organization of 2 million undisciplined men was genuinely difficult to control, and its excesses, the violence, the corruption, the open homosexuality of some SA leadership, were liabilities that conservative allies and the German army both found deeply objectionable. Hitler, characteristically, allowed the tension to build for months before acting on it. The army had made clear to him that its loyalty, and specifically its willingness to transfer its oath of allegiance from the president to Hitler personally, which would be essential when the aging Hindenburg died, was contingent on reassurances that the SA would not absorb or replace the professional military. This was not an abstract concern. Hindenburg was dying. Hitler knew it. The succession was the central political question of 1934, and getting the army on his side for that transition was worth almost any price. What Rome represented, therefore, was not merely a rival power center, but an obstacle to the most important political transaction Hitler needed to complete. On the 30th of June, 1934, and continuing through the 1st and 2nd of July, what became known as the Night of the Long Knives took place. The SA leadership was arrested and shot. Röhm himself was offered a pistol in his cell at Stadelheim prison in Munich and given the opportunity to take his own life. When he refused, he was shot by 2 SS officers. The total number of those killed in the purge is not precisely established by the historical record. Estimates from serious scholars range from approximately 150 to over 200, and some accounts place the number higher. What is documented is that the purge went beyond the SA. Conservative critics of the regime who had no connection to Rome were also killed. General Kurt von Schleicher, Hitler's immediate predecessor as Chancellor, was shot in his home along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, a former Nazi leader who had broken with Hitler over questions of ideology and tactics, was murdered in a Gestapo prison cell. Father Erich Klausener, the leader of Catholic Action in Germany, was shot in his office. The Night of the Long Knives was not just a factional dispute settled by force. It was a demonstration that the new state recognized no limits on what it would do to anyone it perceived as a threat. What followed the purge was, in its own way, as disturbing as the purge itself. On the 3rd of July 1934, the German cabinet, which still existed, still met, passed a law declaring the killings of the preceding 3 days to be legal acts of state self-defense. This was retroactive legalization of murder, and it passed without serious objection from the cabinet ministers who voted for it. Franz von Papen, who had narrowly escaped being killed himself during the purge, remained as vice-chancellor. He did not resign. He did not protest publicly. He later claimed he had considered resignation, but was persuaded that remaining in place was the responsible course. The German legal establishment, judges, professors, lawyers, largely accepted the cabinet's ex post facto ratification without formal protest. Carl Schmitt, the constitutional theorist, published an article explaining the legal basis for the killings in terms that would be taught in German law seminars. The normalization of what had happened was, in some respects, more significant than the killings themselves. The army was satisfied. The SA had been cut down to size. The SS had demonstrated its decisive superiority over its rival, and its power within the Nazi state expanded accordingly. On the 2nd of August, 1934, President Paul von Hindenburg died at his estate in Neudeck, East Prussia. He was 86 years old. Hitler moved within hours. The offices of President and Chancellor were merged by emergency decree into the single position of Führer und Reichskanzler, leader and Reich Chancellor, and the German army, on the same day, administered a new oath of loyalty. Soldiers swore unconditional obedience, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to the office of the Chancellor, but personally to Adolf Hitler by name. This was not a procedural change. It was a fundamental transformation in the nature of German military obligation. An officer who later wished to resist Hitler's orders would not merely be violating military discipline. He would be violating a personal oath sworn before God. The oath would haunt the German resistance movement, the men and women who eventually did resist until the end of the war. Within 19 months of being appointed Chancellor, Hitler had achieved something that no previous German head of government, not Bismarck, not Wilhelm II, had achieved: total, unchecked, formally institutionalized personal authority over the German state. He controlled the government. He controlled the military through the oath. He controlled the legal system through the Enabling Act and its subsequent elaborations. He controlled the press through Reichswehr Ministry of Public Enlightenment and propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. He controlled the economy through a combination of public works, military rearmament spending, and ideological pressure on business. and he controlled the internal security apparatus through Himmler's SS, which had in 1934 absorbed the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police, and was in the process of building the most comprehensive domestic surveillance and repression machinery in German history. Abroad, the consolidation of 1933 and 1934 registered as alarming, but not yet existentially threatening to Germany's neighbours. Britain's response was cautious and somewhat contradictory. There was genuine disgust at the Night of the Long Knives in the British press, but also, in certain political circles, a persistent tendency to view Hitler as a stabilizing force against communism in Central Europe. France was more alarmed, but also more fractured internally, and its military and political leadership could not agree on an adequate response. The United States, under Franklin Roosevelt's administration, was watching but was not positioned to intervene in European affairs in 1934. The neutrality acts that would constrain American foreign policy for the rest of the decade were still being drafted. The international system had observed the construction of a totalitarian state in one of Europe's largest nations in the space of 18 months. And the response had been diplomatic protest, some boycott activity, and a great deal of hoping that the situation would somehow stabilize. It would not stabilize. What 1933 and 1934 had built was not a stable authoritarian equilibrium. It was a system that required constant expansion, of control, of territory, of enemies, to sustain its internal momentum. This is one of the structural insights about the Nazi state that the historian Ian Kershaw has most carefully elaborated. The Third Reich was not a conventional authoritarian system that could settle into a stable mode of governance. Its ideology demanded constant movement, constant radicalization, constant achievement of new goals. The moment of consolidation was also the moment when the next phase began. And the next phase would be directed outward, toward Germany's neighbours, toward the international order, toward the world that had imposed the Peace of Versailles, and was about to discover what kind of settlement that had actually been. Chapter 5, Making Enemies of Citizens, the Nuremberg Laws and the Nazification of Daily Life, 1933-1938. We need to slow down here, not because the pace of events requires it. The pace was, if anything, accelerating, but because there is a tendency in long-form histories of the Third Reich to sprint through the domestic persecution of the 1930s in order to reach the more cinematically obvious drama of the war years. Doing that is a mistake, both historically and morally. What happened to the Jewish community and other persecuted groups inside Germany between 1933 and 1939 was not a prelude to the Holocaust. It was the Holocaust beginning, the mechanism that would eventually be directed toward industrial mass murder was built and tested on German soil, in German cities against German citizens, while German neighbours watched, looked away, sometimes objected quietly, sometimes participated, and sometimes actively profited. The anti-Semitism of the Nazi movement was not a fringe position grafted onto an otherwise mainstream political program. It was, as Hitler himself made clear in Mein Kampf and in countless public speeches, the structural center of the entire worldview. The Nazis believed, with the particular intensity that ideological conviction produces in those committed to it, that Jewish people constituted a racial group that was biologically and culturally incompatible with German society, actively conspiring against German national interests, responsible for Germany's defeat in the First World War, and for the subsequent humiliations of Versailles and Weimar. This was not a metaphor or a rhetorical device. It was what they actually believed, and understanding that they actually believed it, rather than cynically exploiting anti-Semitism for political gain, is important, because ideological believers act with a different kind of persistence than cynical opportunists. The persecution began immediately after the Nazi seizure of power, not waiting for legislation, but running ahead of it. On the 1st of April, 1933, less than 10 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor, the Nazi government organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses, doctors, and lawyers, as men stood outside Jewish shops with placards. The boycott was partially driven by pressure from the Nazi grassroots movement, which was more impatient than the leadership's initial timetable, and it was also a test of how much the German public would accept and how much international reaction would follow. The answer, on both counts, was more than anyone in the German Foreign Office had hoped, and less than the Jewish community had feared, would be the limiting factor on persecution. Over the following 2 years, a cascade of legislation steadily stripped Jewish Germans of their civic standing. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed on the 7th of April, 1933, removed Jews from government employment, including university positions and the judiciary. Jewish doctors were excluded from national health insurance programs. Jewish students faced quotas in universities. The gradual, bureaucratic nature of this exclusion is worth emphasizing. It was carried out through forms, through official notifications, through administrative procedures. People received letters. They filled out questionnaires about their grandparents' religious identities. They were informed by registered post that their positions had been terminated. The ordinariness of the administrative mechanism coexisted with the extraordinary nature of what was being done. And this coexistence is one of the defining features of the Nazi persecution system. On the 15th of September 1935, at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, an event that had itself become a ritual of state power, with hundreds of thousands of attendees and spectacular nocturnal displays of searchlights, flags, and mass formation marching. 2 laws were announced that completed the formal legal exclusion of Jewish Germans from German civil life. The first, the Reich Citizenship Law, defined citizenship as something available only to those of German or kindred blood, which in practice meant that Jewish Germans, and eventually Black Germans and Roma and Sinti Germans, were not citizens. They were state subjects, a legally inferior status with no political rights. The second, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, criminalized marriage and sexual relations between Jews and German citizens, and prohibited Jewish households from employing German women under 45 years of age as domestic workers. The legal complexity of defining who was Jewish produced one of the more grotesque bureaucratic exercises of the period. The first supplementary decree to the Nuremberg laws, issued on the 14th of November, 1935, defined a full Jew as a person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, regardless of that person's own religious practice or self-identification. People who had converted to Christianity generations back were classified as Jewish by a definition they had no say in. The category of Mischling, persons of mixed race, was divided into first and second degree based on the number of Jewish grandparents, and each category had different legal restrictions that themselves changed over subsequent years as the Nazi state progressively radicalized its definitions. The administration of racial identity required the creation of a substantial bureaucratic infrastructure, offices for genealogical research, registries, documentation requirements. Thousands of civil servants were employed in the business of categorizing people by ancestry. It was, in the most literal sense, an industry of exclusion. For the approximately 500,000 Jewish Germans who were subject to these laws in 1935, they represented less than 1% of the German population. The practical consequences were immediate and severe. The ability to practice a profession, to own a business, to attend a university, to employ non-Jewish staff, to have a sexual relationship with a non-Jewish German, to display the German flag. All of these were now either legally restricted or outright prohibited. Emigration was the logical response, and between 1933 and 1939, roughly half of Germany's Jewish population did emigrate to Palestine, to the United States, to Britain, to France, to wherever they could obtain visas. The problem was that obtaining visas became progressively more difficult as European nations and the United States tightened their immigration quotas. The Yverton Conference of July 1938, convened specifically to address the refugee crisis, produced almost nothing of practical value. 32 nations attended, and almost all of them declined to increase their immigration quotas. The door was closing from both sides. For non-Jewish Germans, the Nuremberg laws and the broader Gleichschaltung of daily life posed a different kind of challenge. The Nazi regime was not simply a political government that one could ignore by staying out of politics. It reached into every aspect of life, into education, where children from the age of 10 were enrolled in the Hitler Youth or the League of German Girls, into the workplace, where party membership became a practical requirement for advancement, into neighborhood life, where block wardens monitored compliance and reported deviations to the party, into personal relationships, where the legal prohibition on relations with Jews created a new category of crime from private life. The concept of a private sphere, of a zone of personal life into which the state did not reach, was systematically dismantled. This total mobilization of civil society was not experienced uniformly across Germany. Enforcement varied by region, by social setting, by the personality of local party officials. But the direction of travel was consistent. What the historical record shows, and this is where the research becomes genuinely uncomfortable, is that popular response to the persecution was not primarily one of resistance. There was genuine resistance. Individuals who hid Jewish neighbors, who refused to join the boycotts, who maintained friendships across the racial lines the state was drawing. These people existed, and they deserved to be named and remembered, though they were a minority. The majority of the German population occupied a middle position that is harder to characterize simply. They were not enthusiastic perpetrators, but they were not resistors either. They accommodated. They adjusted their behavior to the new legal and social reality. They accepted, often with varying degrees of discomfort, the progressive exclusion of their Jewish neighbors because the costs of objecting, social, professional, legal, eventually physical, exceeded what most people were willing to bear. The historian Roel Hilberg described this as the Bestander problem, and it remains one of the most studied and debated aspects of the entire period. Robert Gellatley's research in particular has complicated the bystander narrative by demonstrating the extent to which ordinary Germans were informed about and complicit in aspects of persecution that the post-war mythology located exclusively with the SS and the party apparatus. The physical violence that accompanied the legal persecution reached its first major organized expression on the night of the 9th and 10th of November, 1938. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, known more formally as the November Pogrom, organized by the propaganda ministry and the SS leadership, following the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish man. The pogrom saw the destruction of approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses, the burning of around 1,400 synagogues, and the arrest and deportation to concentration camps of approximately 30,000 Jewish men. The economic fine levied on the Jewish community for the damage by a government that had just ordered the destruction was 1 billion Reichsmarks. The pogrom was presented as a spontaneous popular uprising. The glass in the streets of every German city, the smoke from burning synagogues visible for miles, gave the lie to that presentation clearly enough. What Kristallnacht demonstrated was that the violence of the 1920s street politics had been reorganized, systematized, and could be deployed as a state instrument at national scale. By the end of 1938, German Jewish life, which had existed continuously in Germany for more than 1,000 years, which had produced scientists and artists and philosophers and soldiers and doctors and lawyers of international distinction, had been effectively destroyed as a public institution. The people remained for the time being, but the legal, social, and economic infrastructure of their lives in Germany had been dismantled. Those who could leave were leaving. Those who could not, because they were too old, too poor, too attached to places and communities they could not imagine abandoning, or because no country would take them, remained, watching the walls close in and hoping, as people in desperate circumstances tend to hope, that the worst had already happened. Chapter 6. Testing the World, Rearmament, the Rhineland, and the Logic of Appeasement, 1933-1938. While the interior of Germany was being reorganized along totalitarian lines, Hitler was conducting a parallel operation in the field of foreign policy that was, in its own way, equally methodical and equally dependent on the willingness of others to misread what was happening. The foreign policy of the Third Reich between 1933 and 1938 was a sequence of calculated gambles, each one building on the success of the previous, each one designed to test how far the international order would bend before it pushed back. The answer repeatedly was further than anyone except Hitler had expected. This chapter is about those gambles, about the reasoning of the men who failed to stop them, and about the point at which the logic of accommodation ran out. The starting point is German rearmament, which began immediately after Hitler came to power, but which operated initially under conditions of considerable secrecy, since open rearmament would have violated the Treaty of Versailles and potentially triggered Allied intervention. The Versailles Treaty had limited Germany to an army of 100,000 men with no general staff, no air force, no tanks, no submarines, and no heavy artillery beyond certain specified limits. The German military, with considerable ingenuity, had been circumventing these restrictions throughout the Weimar period, training pilots in the Soviet Union under a secret arrangement, developing tank doctrine through exercises with substitute vehicles, maintaining a clandestine general staff structure under bureaucratic camouflage. What the Nazis did after 1933 was accelerate and formalize what had already been occurring underground. In October of 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and from the ongoing disarmament conference in Geneva. The withdrawal was announced as a principled response to Allied refusal to grant Germany genuine equality of armaments, a position that had some diplomatic substance behind it, since France had been resistant to reducing its own forces to German levels under the treaty formula. But the principled argument was cover for a strategic decision. Hitler had concluded that the League of Nations framework was not merely inconvenient, but fundamentally incompatible with German expansion, and that leaving it early, before Germany was strong enough to be openly confronted, was safer than leaving later. The international reaction to the withdrawal was diplomatic protest and eventual resignation. No military consequences followed. The rearmament accelerated through 1934 and into 1935. In March of 1935, Hitler announced publicly what had been an open secret for at least a year. Germany had an air force, the Luftwaffe, and was reintroducing conscription with a target army of 36 divisions. This was an explicit, public, unambiguous violation of the Versailles Treaty. Britain, France, and Italy met at Stresa in April of 1935 and formally condemned the German action. They agreed to consult in future on responses to threats to European peace. This was the Strasser Front, and it lasted approximately 2 months. Chapter 7, The Gathering Storm, Austria, the Sudetenland, and the Road to Munich, 1937 to 1938. By 1937, the international order that had been constructed at Paris in 1919 was not merely under strain. It was functionally broken, and the breaking had been done so gradually, through such carefully calibrated increments, that the men responsible for maintaining it had not been able to agree on precisely when the moment of crisis had arrived. This is one of the deepest problems in the history of the late 1930s. The difficulty of identifying, from inside a sequence of events, where accommodation ends and capitulation begins. The statesmen of Britain and France, who navigated the crises of 1937 and 1938, were not fools. Several of them were experienced, intelligent, genuinely conscientious people who were trying to prevent another European catastrophe while managing domestic political constraints that were real and serious. Understanding why they failed requires understanding the logic of what they were attempting, not in order to excuse them, but in order to understand the particular shape of the catastrophe they were unable to prevent. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who took office in May of 1937, genuinely believed that the grievances the German government was articulating about Versailles, about German minorities in neighboring states, about the inequality of the post-war settlement, contained enough legitimate substance that addressing them through negotiation was both morally appropriate and strategically wise. He was not alone in this belief. A significant current of British political opinion in the mid-1930s held that the Versailles Treaty had been too harsh, that Germany had legitimate claims to revision of its terms, and that Hitler, however distasteful his domestic methods, was essentially a conventional nationalist politician who could be reasoned with if his substantive grievances were met. This was not, on its face, an irrational position. It was wrong, but it was not irrational, given the information available to someone who was not reading Hitler's actual intentions through his publicly stated positions. What Chamberlain and most of the British foreign policy establishment consistently underestimated was the degree to which territorial revision was not Hitler's goal, but merely his current instrument. The internal documents of the Nazi leadership, particularly the record of a meeting on the 5th of November, 1937, taken by Hitler's military adjutant Friedrich Hossbach, and known subsequently as the Hossbach Memorandum, make clear that Hitler had, by late 1937, concluded that German expansion into Eastern Europe was essential and that it would require war. The memorandum records Hitler telling his senior military commanders and foreign minister that Germany's problems could only be solved by force, that the window for acting would open sometime between 1943 and 1945, when Germany's military advantage would be at its peak, but that earlier opportunities should be seized if they presented themselves. The Hossbach Memorandum is one of the most debated documents in the historiography of the period. Its precise status as a planning document versus a statement of contingent intent has been argued at length, but its general direction is unmistakable. This was not a politician articulating revisionist claims. This was a military strategic planning session for a war of conquest. Austria was the first target after the Rhineland. The connection between Austria and Germany, linguistic, cultural, and for some political currents, national, had been a live question since the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. The Versailles Treaty and the Treaty of Saint-Germain had explicitly prohibited an Anschluss, a union between Germany and Austria, on the reasonable grounds that adding Austria to Germany would make Germany significantly larger and stronger than it had been before the war. The Austrian Nazi Party had been agitating for years, with substantial support from Berlin, and in July of 1934, the same month as the Night of the Long Knives, Austrian Nazis had assassinated Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss in a failed coup attempt. Mussolini had responded by moving Italian troops to the Austrian border, and Hitler had backed down. By 1938, however, Mussolini's position had changed. His intervention in the Spanish Civil War, alongside Germany, the formation of the Rome-Berlin Axis in November of 1936, and his own mounting dependence on German political support, had shifted Italy from a potential obstacle to German expansion into something much closer to an accommodation. The Austrian crisis of February and March of 1938 moved with a speed that left the international community effectively paralyzed. By the time it registered what was happening, the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg had been summoned to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden on the 12th of February 1938, where he was subjected to hours of intimidation, threats of immediate military action against Austria, and forced to sign an agreement that essentially placed Austrian Nazis in key government positions, including the Interior Ministry. Schuschnigg attempted to recover the initiative by announcing a plebiscite on Austrian independence for the 13th of March. Hitler responded by demanding Schuschnigg's resignation, replacing him with the Austrian Nazi Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and ordering German military forces across the Austrian border on the 12th of March, 1938. The formal annexation, the Anschluss, was announced on the 13th of March. Austria ceased to exist as an independent state. It became the Ostmark, a province of the German Reich. The international response was diplomatic protest. France was in a governmental crisis and had no functioning cabinet on the day of the annexation. Britain protested formally and did nothing beyond protesting. The absorption of Austria added approximately 7 million people and significant industrial and mineral resources to the Reich. It also created a direct German border with Czechoslovakia's southern frontier, which had strategic implications immediately understood by every military planner in Europe. Czechoslovakia, with its substantial German-speaking minority concentrated in the Sudetenland border regions, was now surrounded on three sides by German territory. The Sudetenland had been incorporated into Czechoslovakia in 1919, over the objections of many of its German-speaking inhabitants, on the grounds that it was geographically and economically inseparable from the Czech lands. Its population of approximately 3 million ethnic Germans had legitimate political grievances, genuine questions of minority rights and political representation that the Czechoslovak government had not always addressed adequately. Hitler had no interest in minority rights. He had an interest in Czechoslovakia's strategic position and in the Skoda armaments at Pilsen, one of the most productive weapons manufacturing facilities in Central Europe. The crisis over the Sudetenland that dominated European diplomacy throughout the summer and autumn of 1938 was played out against a background of genuine, widespread terror of another European war. The memories of the First World War were not history for the politicians and populations of 1938. They were personal experience. Chamberlain had lost men close to him in that war. The generation that would fight a new war were the children of men who had fought the previous one, and the casualty figures of 1914 to 1918. Roughly 9 million military dead in Europe were not statistics, but social facts embedded in every community. The fear of war was not irrational or cowardly. It was a rational response to living memory. The question is whether that fear was exploited, and where the line between prudent caution and catastrophic appeasement lay. Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times in September of 1938 in an attempt to negotiate a settlement of the Sudetenland crisis. The first meeting at Berchtesgaden on the 15th of September resulted in a British acceptance in principle of Germany's claim to the Sudetenland under the right of national self-determination. The second, at Bad Godesberg on the 22nd of September, revealed that Hitler had escalated his demands beyond what had been agreed at Berchtesgaden. He now wanted immediate military occupation without waiting for an agreed transfer process. This pushed even Chamberlain to the edge of breakdown in the negotiations. For several days in late September, European war seemed genuinely imminent. Gas masks were distributed in London. Trenches were dug in Hyde Park. The French army began partial mobilization. Then Mussolini, responding to a German request, proposed a four-power conference in Munich. On the 29th and 30th of September 1938, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich and agreed to the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany on a timetable only marginally better than Hitler's Godesberg ultimatum. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference that decided its fate. The Soviet Union, which had a mutual assistance treaty with Czechoslovakia, was not consulted. Chamberlain returned to London on the 30th of September 1938, carrying the document he had signed with Hitler, declaring the desire of their two peoples never to go to war again, and spoke the words, "Peace for our time," that would define his legacy permanently and not in the way he intended. The criticism of Munich has been so thorough, so sustained, and in retrospect so obviously correct, that it requires a small effort of historical fairness to acknowledge the genuine uncertainty that surrounded the decision at the time. Britain was not militarily ready for a major war in September of 1938. Its air defences were inadequate. Spitfire production had barely begun. The army had almost no modern armoured capability. The year gained between Munich and the outbreak of war in September of 1939 was used to accelerate British rearmament in ways that would prove critical. Some historians, notably John Chalmley in his controversial study of Chamberlain, have argued that Munich bought Britain the time it needed. Others point out that Czechoslovakia's formidable fortifications and 35 trained divisions given up at Munich represented a military asset that Britain and France could never adequately compensate for. What ended the Munich calculation permanently was not a theoretical argument, but a practical demonstration. In March of 1939, Hitler ordered the occupation of the remaining Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia, and the establishment of a German protectorate over them. There was no Sudeten German minority in Prague. There was no self-determination argument. There was no grievance from Versailles. The German army entered a sovereign state and absorbed it by force. For Chamberlain, who had constructed his entire policy around the proposition that Hitler's aims were limited and revision-oriented, this was a political catastrophe. It proved that he had been wrong about the nature of what he was dealing with. In the House of Commons, the criticism was thunderous. Within weeks, Britain issued a guarantee of Poland's independence, a statement that if Germany attacked Poland, Britain would declare war. The policy of appeasement as a strategy for preserving peace was over. What remained was the question of whether the guarantee to Poland would be honoured when Hitler moved against it, as everyone in every European foreign ministry knew he would. The period between the Anschluss in March of 1938 and the fall of Prague in March of 1939 represents, in retrospect, the last window in which the Third Reich's expansion could have been stopped at a cost that, while enormous, would have been far less than the eventual cost of the war that followed. The Czech army was well trained and well equipped. The Czech fortifications in the Sudetenland had been constructed with French technical assistance and were genuinely formidable. A Franco-British decision to honour their implicit commitments to Czechoslovakia in September of 1938 would have meant war. The generals on both sides knew this. What the British and French governments did not know and what German military records have subsequently revealed, is that several senior Wehrmacht generals had concluded that a war in September of 1938, when Germany would have faced Czechoslovakia, France, Britain, and possibly the Soviet Union simultaneously, would have been unwinnable. Some of them had discussed, cautiously and inconclusively, the possibility of a coup against Hitler if the political leadership drove Germany into a war the military could not win. Munich removed the precondition for that coup by removing the war. Chapter 8, The Pact with the Devil, Molotov-Ribbentrop, and the Last Days of Peace, 1938 to 1939. The story of the summer of 1939 is the story of two diplomatic processes running simultaneously, each of which would define the character of the war that was about to begin. The first was the British and French effort to construct some form of deterrent coalition that might convince Hitler that an attack on Poland would trigger consequences he could not survive. The second was the German effort to ensure that any such coalition would lack its most essential Eastern member. Both efforts were prosecuted with urgency and with considerable skill. One of them succeeded. The question of why the other failed is not simple, and the answer involves calculations of power, ideology, mistrust, and geography that deserve more careful examination than they typically receive. Poland's position in the European strategic equation was paradoxical. The British Guarantee of March of 1939 had been issued with considerable diplomatic fanfare, but its practical implementation depended on a military reality that was deeply uncomfortable. Britain and France could not, by themselves, effectively defend Poland against a German attack. They could attack Germany from the west, as they had in 1914, but they could not get troops to Poland across the geography of Central Europe in time to prevent its military defeat. The only power that could physically defend Poland, or, more precisely, create sufficient military pressure on Germany's eastern front to prevent Poland from being overwhelmed, was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had a common border with Poland, had fought a war with Poland as recently as 1920, and controlled territory in eastern Poland that it regarded as legitimately its own. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's position in the summer of 1939 was one of the most consequential in the entire history of the period, and it was shaped by calculations that were internally consistent, however catastrophic their external results. Stalin had watched the Munich Conference, which had excluded the Soviet Union from a settlement of a crisis that directly affected Soviet security interests, with the clear implication that the Western powers were not averse to redirecting German expansion eastward. The Soviet Union's Mutual Assistance Treaty with France, signed in 1935, had produced almost nothing of practical military value, since France had never negotiated the military convention that would have given the treaty operational content. Soviet feelers about collective security arrangements had been met with varying degrees of British coolness. Stalin concluded, not entirely without justification, that Britain and France were willing to allow Germany to expand at Soviet expense. The British and French negotiations with the Soviet Union in the summer of 1939 were characterized by a slowness and a series of procedural delays that Soviet historians have pointed to, with some justification, as evidence of bad faith, though the picture is considerably more complicated. The British sent a negotiating delegation to Moscow by boat, which took several weeks, rather than by air, in July of 1939. The delegation was headed by Admiral Reginald Drax, who had been given no authority to make commitments. The French delegation was somewhat more authoritative. The military talks that began in August founded on a specific and in retrospect decisive question: the right of Soviet troops to enter Poland and Romania in the event of German attack. Poland refused to grant this right. Its government regarded the presence of Soviet troops on Polish soil as a threat to Polish sovereignty, roughly equivalent to the German threat it was designed to counter. Given Poland's experience of Soviet invasion in 1920, this was not an irrational position. It was, however, one that made the construction of an effective anti-German coalition on the Eastern Front essentially impossible. Germany moved first. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, flew to Moscow on the 23rd of August, 1939, in less than 24 hours of negotiations, an extraordinarily compressed time frame for an agreement of this magnitude. He and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov signed the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The public text committed both sides to neutrality if either were attacked by a third party. The secret protocol, whose existence the Soviet Union denied for 50 years until its acknowledgement under Gorbachev, divided Eastern Europe into German-Soviet spheres of influence. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the eastern part of Poland fell in the Soviet sphere. Lithuania and the western part of Poland fell in the German sphere. Bessarabia, a disputed territory between Romania and the Soviet Union, was assigned to Soviet interests. With a single agreement, Hitler had eliminated the threat of a two-front war that had destroyed Germany in 1914 to 1918. He had also, though neither party publicly acknowledged this, given Stalin the green light to pursue his own territorial expansion, with consequences that would reshape the Baltic states, Finland and eastern Poland, within the following 12 months. The news of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when its public face became known on the 24th of August, struck European chancelleries with something close to physical shock. The Nazi-Soviet pact appeared to be an ideological impossibility. The two systems had defined themselves, in rhetoric that both sides had employed with considerable ferocity throughout the 1930s, as each other's existential enemies. Nazi propaganda had identified Bolshevism as the primary instrument of Jewish world conspiracy. Soviet propaganda had identified fascism as the armed expression of monopoly capitalism. That the two states could conclude a non-aggression agreement of this kind seemed to violate the fundamental political logic of the era. What both sides understood, and what the ideological noise had partially obscured, was that they were both great power states with territorial ambitions, and that in the short term, those ambitions could be advanced more efficiently in parallel than in opposition. For the British and French governments, the pact created an immediate and impossible-seeming situation. The strategic logic that had underpinned the guarantee to Poland that Germany would face unacceptable Eastern pressure if it moved west had been eliminated at a stroke. Poland, without Soviet support, and without the physical ability of Britain and France to defend it militarily, faced the German Wehrmacht essentially alone. The British government debated whether to honour the guarantee, the arguments for revisiting it, the changed strategic situation, the need for more time to rearm, the terrible cost in lives that honouring it would entail, were real and were made with sincerity. But the political cost of abandoning Poland after a public guarantee, and more fundamentally, the recognition that if Hitler could be bought off with Poland, he would simply proceed to the next target, ultimately settled the debate. The guarantee would be honoured. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain and France would declare war. Hitler had publicly demanded the return of Danzig to Germany and the construction of an extraterritorial road and rail corridor connecting Germany proper to East Prussia through the Polish corridor. These demands had been presented throughout the summer as a final settlement, the last territorial revision required to address Germany's Versailles grievances. Polish diplomatic and intelligence assessments, and indeed German military planning documents, tell a consistent story. The Danzig and corridor demands were not the real goal. They were the pretext. The military planning, Operation White, Fall Weiss, had been issued to the Wehrmacht in April of 1939, with a target date of the 1st of September. Hitler had told his generals, in May of 1939, that the question was not Danzig or the corridor, but the expansion of Germany's living space and the securing of food supplies from the east. The Danzig crisis was the mechanism, not the motive. On the evening of the 31st of August, 1939, an SS operation involving concentration camp prisoners dressed in Polish uniforms staged an attack on a German radio station at Gleiwitz, near the Polish border. The operation, known by its codename Unternehmen Himmler, was designed to provide a fabricated Polish provocation that the German government could point to as the cause of the military response it had already decided to initiate. The following morning, the 1st of September, 1939, at approximately 0430 hours, the Wehrmacht crossed the Polish frontier along multiple axes. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had been visiting Danzig on a courtesy visit, opened fire on the Polish garrison at the Westerplatte at approximately 4:45 in the morning. The air campaign began simultaneously, targeting Polish airfields, railway junctions, and communications infrastructure. The Second World War had begun, though it would not be officially declared until 2 days later, when Britain and France, after an agonizing and almost catastrophic delay driven by Italian mediation attempts, issued their ultimatums to Berlin. Britain's ultimatum expired at 11 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd of September, 1939. Chamberlain broadcast to the British people at 11:15, his voice carrying the exhaustion and defeat of a man who had devoted the final years of his career to preventing precisely what had now happened. France's ultimatum expired 5 hours later. Germany was at war with Britain and France. Though neither Britain nor France had any military capability to assist Poland, which was already fighting for its survival on 3 axes of advance, the war that would last nearly 6 years, kill somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, reshape every political boundary on Earth, and produce the first use of nuclear weapons in combat, had its immediate origin in a railway corridor and a port city on the Baltic. But its actual origin was in a beer hall in Munich in November of 1923, in a prison cell in Landsberg, where a man had dictated his intentions clearly enough for anyone willing to read them, and in a sequence of choices, some of them understandable, some of them cowardly, some of them the product of genuine structural forces, that had brought Germany and Europe to the morning of the 1st of September, 1939. The speed of Poland's defeat shocked even German military planners who had designed the campaign with confidence in its outcome. The Wehrmacht's operational approach, using concentrated armored and motorized formations to penetrate deeply behind enemy lines, rather than methodically destroying Polish forces frontally, was not a wholly new concept, but its execution against Poland was its first test at scale. Polish resistance was fierce and, in several engagements, tactically successful against individual German units. But the operational structure of the Polish defense, which relied on holding a long perimeter rather than concentrating forces for flexible response, could not cope with simultaneous penetrations at multiple points. By the 8th of September, German forces had reached the outskirts of Warsaw. On the 17th of September, Soviet forces entered Poland from the east, under the terms of the secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was fighting a war on 2 fronts against 2 of the largest military forces in the world. Warsaw surrendered on the 27th of September. The last organized Polish resistance ended on the 6th of October. Poland had ceased to exist as a state. The occupation regime that replaced it would prove, over the following years, to be among the most brutal in the history of European conquest. Chapter 9: Blitzkrieg, the fall of France, and the isolation of Britain, 1939 to 1940. The 8 months between the fall of Poland in October of 1939 and the fall of France in June of 1940 are among the most studied, and in some respects the most genuinely surprising periods of the entire Second World War. Surprising because what happened in May of 1940? The complete, rapid, catastrophic military defeat of France, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, and the transformation of the strategic landscape of the entire war was not predicted by the best military minds in Europe. France in 1940 was not the France of 1914, weakened, unprepared, without allies. It was, by most quantitative measures, a formidably equipped military power with more tanks than Germany deployed in the Western campaign, more artillery, a roughly equivalent air force, the support of a British expeditionary force of 10 divisions, and the advantage of fighting on the defensive behind fixed fortifications. How France lost that campaign is one of the most instructive stories in modern military history. And what it tells us is not a simple story about German genius and French cowardice. It is a story about doctrine, command structure, and the disastrous consequences of preparing precisely for the war you already fought. The period from October of 1939 to May of 1940, the phony war, as it was called in Britain, or the drôle de guerre in France, was characterized by a peculiar suspended quality. France and Britain were formally at war with Germany, but conducting almost no offensive operations. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line, the extraordinary system of fortifications built along the Franco-German border between 1930 and 1936, at a cost that amounted to approximately 3 billion francs. The Maginot Line was, as a fixed fortification, genuinely impressive. Its underground galleries, hospitals, power plants, and artillery casemates were engineering achievements of a high order. As a strategy, it had one structural problem that its designers had recognized but had been unable to resolve politically. It ended at the Belgian border. France had not extended the fortifications northward along the Franco-Belgian frontier, partly because the cost was prohibitive, and partly because the Belgians had objected, not wishing their country to be defined as the terrain on which future Franco-German wars would be fought. German planning for the Western campaign went through several versions before arriving at the one that was actually executed. The initial plan, called Fallgelb, or Kessess Yellow, was a conventional right-wing wheeling movement through Belgium and the Netherlands, resembling in its broad structure the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. It was captured by Allied forces when a German aircraft carrying an officer with planning documents made an emergency landing in Belgium in January of 1940. Whether the capture of these documents changed French strategic thinking is debated by historians, but the plan itself was in any case being reconsidered within German military circles. General Erich von Manstein had been advocating since October of 1939 for a radical alternative. Instead of the predictable sweep through Belgium that Allied planning was prepared to counter, the main German effort should go through the Ardennes forest. Terrain considered largely impassable for armoured vehicles by French military doctrine, with the aim of breaking through to the coast at the mouth of the Somme and cutting off the Allied forces that had advanced into Belgium from their supply lines and reserves. The Manstein Plan was adopted after considerable resistance from the German Army High Command in early 1940. It was operationally audacious in a way that conventional military planning tends to avoid, precisely because its requirements, forcing large numbers of armoured vehicles through narrow Ardennes roads, depending on speed and surprise, to prevent the Allies from reacting in time. created a catastrophic vulnerability if the French moved quickly to counter the penetration. What the plan required and what the execution delivered was a tempo of advance faster than the French command structure could process and respond to. This is the key insight. The German operational success in May of 1940 was not primarily about superior weapons or superior individual soldiers. It was about decision-making speed at the operational level. German armoured commanders had been given a degree of initiative and authority to press forward without waiting for orders that French doctrine, with its more centralized and methodical command culture, simply did not permit. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany launched simultaneous attacks into the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The dramatic paratroop assault on the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael, captured in about 18 hours by a force of fewer than 500 men, and the crossing of the Dutch waterlines announced an operational tempo that Allied planning had not anticipated. The Allied forces in France, French Army Group 1, and the British Expeditionary Force executed their planned response, advancing into Belgium to meet the expected German main effort. They were moving into a trap. While the Allied forces moved north into Belgium, the main German armoured force, 7 panzer divisions under General Ewald von Kleist, with Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps leading, was grinding through the Ardennes. By the 13th of May, German panzers had crossed the Meuse River at Sedan and were pushing west. The French had reserves available to counter this penetration. What they could not do was make the command decisions fast enough to deploy them effectively before the German advance had progressed beyond the point where reserves could close the gap. The Dunkirk evacuation, Operation Dynamo, which ran from the 26th of May to the 4th of June, 1940, entered British national mythology immediately and has remained there. Approximately 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk by a fleet of naval vessels and civilian boats, the famous little ships, operating under continuous air attack from the Luftwaffe. The evacuation was genuinely remarkable as a logistical achievement under fire. It was also, as Churchill was careful to note in his address to the House of Commons on the 4th of June, a defeat. A considerable quantity of British military equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles, ammunition, was left on the beaches. The French army, which was still fighting while the evacuation proceeded, and which provided a substantial proportion of the troops evacuated, would continue fighting in France for 3 more weeks. But the effective end of a coherent Allied military strategy in France had come before Dunkirk, when the German armoured corridor to the coast had been established and held. France's formal armistice with Germany was signed on the 22nd of June, 1940, in the same railway carriage in the Commiat Forest, where Germany had signed the armistice in November of 1918, a deliberate staging by Hitler that was both symbolically precise and personally revealing. The armistice divided France into a German-occupied zone covering roughly the northern 3/5 of the country, including Paris and the Atlantic coast, and an unoccupied zone in the south, administered by a French government headquartered at Vichy, under the aged First World War hero Marshal Philippe Pétain. The Vichy government was not a puppet state in the same organizational sense as the German administration in occupied Poland. It had genuine authority in its zone, retained French colonial possessions, and pursued its own policies, some of which, particularly regarding the persecution of Jews and the active collaboration with German demands, went beyond what German occupation authorities required. The history of Vichy France and French collaboration remains one of the most painful chapters in French national memory, and one that French historical scholarship has only relatively recently confronted with the directness it requires. Britain, in June of 1940, found itself in a position without recent historical parallel. The only major power still actively fighting Germany in Europe, with its main continental ally defeated, with its army's equipment largely lost at Dunkirk, with its air force stretched thin, and with an adversary whose military had just demonstrated, in 6 weeks, that it could achieve what Imperial Germany had failed to do in 4 years. The new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who had replaced Chamberlain on the 10th of May, the same day the Western Campaign began, understood the strategic situation with a clarity that was at times almost painful to read. His speeches to the House of Commons in May and June of 1940 are masterpieces of political communication, but they are also documents of genuine strategic purpose. Churchill was not merely rallying the British public. He was broadcasting to the United States that Britain would not make a separate peace, that the British Empire was still in the field, and that American support, material, financial, and ultimately military, was both necessary and potentially available. Hitler's decision not to press the military advantage after the fall of France and force a resolution with Britain before the window of opportunity closed is one of the most studied command decisions of the entire war. Multiple explanations have been offered. That Hitler expected Britain to accept reasonable peace terms and was awaiting a British approach. That the Wehrmacht's logistics and operational capabilities needed time to reconstitute after the Western Campaign. That the Luftwaffe genuinely believed it could force Britain's capitulation through air power alone, eliminating the need for the extraordinarily risky cross-channel invasion plan. All of these factors played a role. What is clear is that the German planning process for an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, Unternehmen Seelohe, was initiated too late, was dependent on achieving air superiority that the Luftwaffe proved unable to deliver, and was regarded with varying degrees of skepticism by German naval commanders who understood the difficulty of crossing the Channel against British naval opposition. The Battle of Britain, which began in earnest in July of 1940 and reached its crisis point in August and September, was a genuinely close-run affair. But its outcome, British survival as an independent combatant, transformed the strategic structure of the war. Germany had won its greatest military campaign and found itself no closer to ending the war. The fall of France in June of 1940 had consequences beyond the immediate military situation. It demonstrated to every government in the world that the Wehrmacht was qualitatively different from any military force they had previously estimated. The Soviet Union, which had been watching German operations with professional attention, drew operational conclusions that would inform Soviet military planning. Though the conclusions drawn were not always accurate, Japan, observing the collapse of European colonial power in Southeast Asia as France and the Netherlands were defeated, began to recalculate the opportunities available in the Pacific. The United States, watching from across the Atlantic, faced a stark new strategic reality. The balance of power in Europe, which American policy had long assumed would sustain itself without American intervention, had been shattered. President Roosevelt's subsequent steps toward increasing support for Britain, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September of 1940, the Lend-Lease Act of March of 1941, reflected a strategic recognition that a Europe dominated by the Third Reich posed an unacceptable threat to American security and economic interests. The fall of France was, in this sense, the event that made American entry into the war eventually inevitable. Chapter 10. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the War of Annihilation, 1940 to 1941. There is a particular kind of decision that combines strategic recklessness with ideological conviction in proportions that defy normal risk assessment, and the German decision to invade the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, represents perhaps the clearest example of that combination in modern military history. Napoleon had made a version of the same mistake in 1812. The German army's historians and planners knew this. Some of them argued against it or against the timeline. Their objections were registered, noted, and set aside. Understanding why Hitler made this decision and why the German military went along with it requires understanding both the strategic logic and the ideological imperatives that made the Soviet Union not merely a military target, but, in Hitler's conception, a necessary one. The strategic argument for attacking the Soviet Union before the war with Britain was resolved had a superficial coherence that was used to justify the decision to the military leadership. Britain's ability to remain in the war, the argument went, was sustained in part by the hope that the Soviet Union and the United States would eventually enter as allies. Eliminating the Soviet Union as a potential British ally would, in this logic, remove that hope and force Britain to accept terms. There was also a resource argument. The Soviet Union controlled vast agricultural lands in Ukraine, significant oil reserves in the Caucasus, an industrial capacity that, if absorbed, would make the German war economy essentially self-sufficient, regardless of any naval blockade. This was not a trivial consideration. Germany's resource vulnerabilities, particularly oil, were real and would eventually prove decisive. The Soviet Union's resources were also real. The connection between them in German strategic planning was not entirely irrational. What the strategic argument obscured was that the military capacity required to conquer and hold the Soviet Union exceeded what Germany actually possessed. This was not secret information. The Soviet Union's territory east of Moscow alone was larger than the entire European theatre. Its population was approximately 3 times Germany's. Its military had been badly damaged by Stalin's purges of the officer corps between 1936 and 1938, which had removed a substantial proportion of the Red Army's experienced senior commanders. But it retained enormous manpower reserves and a defense industrial base, much of it relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, beyond any conceivable German reach, that could sustain losses on a scale that would destroy any comparable German force. The German planning assumption that the Soviet state would collapse rapidly once its frontier armies were destroyed, just as France had collapsed once its main forces were encircled, was not based on careful analysis of Soviet political and social resilience. It was based on ideological assumptions about Soviet racial and political inferiority that the German military had absorbed from Nazi propaganda, and that its own professional culture had not adequately challenged. Operation Barbarossa began in the early hours of the 22nd of June, 1941, along a front stretching approximately 2,900 kilometers from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. 3 army groups, North, Center, and South, advanced simultaneously. Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3, aimed for Moscow along the most direct axis. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. Army Group South aimed for Kiev and the Ukrainian agricultural lands. The initial weeks of the campaign produced results that seemed to justify the most optimistic German projections. Soviet frontier armies were encircled in a series of enormous operations. At Białystok-Minsk in late June, at Smolensk in July, at Kiev in September, at Vyazma-Bryansk in October, that resulted in the capture of millions of Soviet prisoners of war. By the autumn of 1941, Germany had advanced further and faster into Soviet territory than any previous invader. But the Soviet state had not collapsed. The Red Army, shattered as it repeatedly was at the operational level, continued to form new units, to receive new equipment from factories that had been relocated east, and to fight. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war and of the civilian population of the occupied Soviet territories, was governed from the beginning of the campaign by a set of orders that placed Barbarossa in a different moral and legal category from the German operations in France and the Low Countries. The Commissar Order, the Kommissarbefehl, issued on the 6th of June, 1941, directed that captured Soviet political officers were to be shot rather than treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. The hunger plan developed by the German Economic Planning Organization projected the deliberate diversion of Soviet agricultural production to German military and home consumption, with the explicit acceptance that this would result in the starvation of tens of millions of Soviet civilians. These were not improvised policies developed in the heat of combat. They were planned, drafted, debated, and issued as official directives before the campaign began. The war in the East was conceived from the outset as a war of annihilation, Vernichtungskrieg, in which the normal constraints of international law, already significantly eroded, were explicitly set aside. The relationship between the military campaign and the Holocaust is one of the most important and contested areas of the historiography of this period. The mass shooting operations carried out by SS mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, began immediately after the German invasion and operated in the wake of the advancing army. By the end of 1941, these units, sometimes assisted by German police battalions, Romanian troops, and local collaborators, had killed somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 Soviet Jews. The scale and method of these killings, mass shootings at sites such as Babi Yar near Kiev, where approximately 33,900 Jews were killed over 2 days in late September of 1941, represented a qualitative escalation in the persecution that had begun in Germany in 1933. The question of when the decision was made to extend the mass murder of Soviet Jews to a continental program targeting all of European Jewry is one of the most debated questions in Holocaust historiography, with scholars divided between those who see a precise decision point and those who describe a process of progressive radicalization without a single identifiable moment. What the documentary evidence confirms is that by the autumn and winter of 1941, the killing was expanding beyond the Soviet territories, and the decisions that would produce the industrialized murder of the death camps were being made. The winter of 1941 brought the first major German military reverse of the war. Army Group Center's advance on Moscow had been delayed, first by the decision to redirect forces from the Central Axis to support the encirclements at Kiev in September, a decision that generated significant disagreements between Hitler and his senior commanders, and then by the autumn rains that turned Soviet roads to mud and brought the advance to a halt. Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, resumed in October, but reached its effective limit within roughly 30 kilometers of the Soviet capital in early December. The German army, which had advanced without adequate preparation for winter warfare, assuming the campaign would be won before cold weather arrived, was caught in temperatures that dropped to -30 and below, with soldiers lacking adequate winter clothing, vehicles whose lubricants froze, weapons that stopped functioning. On the 5th and 6th of December 1941, the Red Army launched a large-scale counter-offensive west of Moscow, pushing German forces back from 30 to over 100 kilometers in some sectors. The day after the Soviet counteroffensive began, the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. On the 11th of December, Hitler declared war on the United States. The declaration was not required by Germany's treaty obligations with Japan, which bound Germany only in the case of an attack on Japan, not in the case of a Japanese attack on a third party. It was a decision made freely, and it is one of the most strategically inexplicable decisions of the entire war. The United States' industrial capacity, roughly equal at this point to the combined capacity of all the other major belligerents together, was now formally committed to Germany's destruction. Whatever the theoretical possibility of a German victory in the war had been on the 10th of December 1941, it was qualitatively smaller on the 12th. The failure before Moscow in December of 1941 produced a crisis in the German High Command that resulted in the dismissal or resignation of most of the senior army commanders who had planned and conducted Barbarossa. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, was relieved. Hitler assumed personal command of the army as its commander-in-chief, an assumption of direct military authority that would have profound consequences for the conduct of operations in subsequent years. The friction between Hitler's strategic instincts and the professional judgment of his generals, which had existed since 1938, was now structurally embedded in the command system in a way from which it could not be disentangled. And the army that remained in the East, after the failures of the winter of 1941 to 42, was qualitatively different from the force that had crossed the Soviet border in June. It had suffered enormous casualties. Its equipment losses had been severe. Its experienced junior officers and NCOs, the men who made the operational effectiveness of the German army in blitzkrieg conditions possible, were being replaced by men who had not received the same training. The Wehrmacht could still fight. It could still conduct large-scale operations. But the army of June of 1941 and the army of December of 1941 were not the same army. Chapter 11. The final solution. The construction and operation of the death camp system, 1941 to 1944. This chapter requires a different kind of attention from everything that has preceded it, not because the material is more historically complex. In some respects, it is simpler, in the sense that what happened is better documented than many events of this period, but because the subject demands a kind of deliberate, unhurried engagement that long-form narrative can sometimes obscure by embedding horror within momentum. The Holocaust was not a byproduct of the Second World War. It was not a consequence of the chaos of military operations. It was a planned, bureaucratically organized, industrially implemented program of mass murder that required the cooperation of many thousands of individuals across multiple state agencies, occupied territories, and military commands. Understanding how it was built, who built it, and what the building required in terms of institutional and individual cooperation is the central moral obligation of anyone who engages seriously with this period. The transition from mass shootings in the East to what the Nazi leadership called the final solution to the Jewish question, Endlösung der Judenfrage, involved a set of organizational decisions made between the late summer and the winter of 1941. The Wannsee Conference, held on the 20th of January, 1942, in a villa on the Wannsee Lake in suburban Berlin, is often described as the meeting at which the final solution was decided. The historical reality is more complicated. The Wannsee Conference was primarily a coordination meeting among senior officials from multiple ministries and the SS, called by Reinhard Heydrich, to ensure that everyone understood their role in a program that had already been decided upon in its broad outlines. Its importance lies less in what was decided at the meeting than in what the meeting reveals. The bureaucratic normality with which mass murder was being discussed and organized. The senior government officials present, who ask practical questions about implementation, rather than moral questions about intention. And the record. The Wannsee Protocol, which survived in a single copy, overlooked in the Foreign Ministry files, that documents the explicit discussion of the murder of approximately 11 million European Jews, with all the tone and vocabulary of an administrative planning session. The death camps As distinct from the concentration camps, which had existed since 1933 and served primarily as sites of forced labor, political imprisonment, and brutal treatment, were established specifically for the purpose of systematic mass murder. Chelmno, in the Warthegau region of occupied Poland, began operations in December of 1941, using carbon monoxide gas pumped into sealed vans. The Aktion Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, began operations in 1942 and were built specifically for the murder of the Jews of occupied Poland, using carbon monoxide generated by diesel engines in stationary gas chambers. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the most well-known and the site of the largest number of deaths, used Zyklon B, a commercial fumigant, in purpose-built gas chambers combined with crematoria, and operated as both a death camp and a labor camp simultaneously. Majdanek, in the Lublin district, had similar dual functions. The geographic concentration of these facilities in occupied Polish territory, far from German population centers, easily screened from international observation, was not accidental. The Aktion Reinhard program, which operated through 1942 and into 1943, murdered the majority of Poland's approximately 3 million Jews in roughly 18 months. The operation was conducted with an efficiency that required the active participation of railway administration, local police, and gendarmerie, Jewish councils who were deceived about the destination of deportation transports, and a relatively small corps of SS and police personnel running the actual camps. The academic work on the relationship between the German railway system, the Reichsbahn, and the deportation process is particularly revealing. Train schedules, tariff structures, and routing decisions were managed through normal bureaucratic channels, the same administrative procedures used for any freight movement. The industrialization of murder produced a bureaucratic normalization that remains one of the most studied and least fully explained aspects of the Holocaust. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed in her coverage of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, was an attempt to describe this normalization, and it has been debated, refined, and challenged by historians ever since, with no consensus on whether it captures or conceals the nature of individual responsibility. The world outside the Reich knew, to varying degrees and with varying specificity, that mass murder was taking place in occupied Europe. The Polish government in exile in London was broadcasting information about the killings from 1942. Jewish organizations in Britain and the United States were receiving reports and lobbying their governments. The New York Times ran articles on the killings in 1942, though not always on its front pages, and not always with the specificity that would have made the scale unmistakable. The Allied governments received a joint declaration in December of 1942, signed by the major Allied powers, which explicitly stated that the German authorities were now carrying into effect Hitler's oft-repeated intention to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe. That declaration was noted, debated, and essentially produced no significant policy response in terms of military action designed specifically to impede the killing. The debate about what the Allies could or should have done, whether the rail lines to Auschwitz could and should have been bombed, whether more aggressive refugee policies could have saved more lives, has continued in the historical literature and has not been resolved. The experience of Jewish communities across occupied Europe varied by geography, by the nature of the occupying authority, and by the response of local populations. In the Netherlands, approximately 75% of the Jewish population was deported and murdered, one of the highest proportional death tolls in Western Europe, in part because of the efficiency of Dutch administrative records and the relative cooperation of Dutch local authorities. though this is a deeply contested aspect of Dutch wartime history. In Denmark, the Jewish community was warned of an imminent deportation order in October of 1943, and in a collective response that has no real parallel in occupied Western Europe, was evacuated across the Øresund Strait straight to neutral Sweden by Danish fishing boats and private citizens in the space of a few days. Approximately 7,000 of Denmark's approximately 8,000 Jews survived the war. In Bulgaria, government resistance to German deportation demands preserved most of the Bulgarian Jewish community. In Hungary, which had retained a degree of sovereignty as a German ally until March of 1944, more than 400,000 Jews were deported to Auschwitz between May and July of 1944. In the final year of the war, when the outcome was already clear to any informed observer, in an operation of staggering speed and deliberateness that demonstrates the priority the Nazi leadership gave to the killing program, even when it was consuming transport resources the military desperately needed. The relationship between the broader German population and knowledge of the Holocaust is an area of scholarship where the research of the last 3 decades has significantly revised what the immediate post-war generation was able or willing to acknowledge. The claim, widespread in Germany after 1945, that ordinary Germans did not know about the mass murders in the East has been substantially undermined by studies of letters sent home by soldiers, by testimony about what soldiers reported when on leave, by the public statements of Nazi leaders that were not entirely coded, by the extensive bureaucratic infrastructure that required the cooperation of thousands of civil servants. The historian Peter Longerich, in his study of knowledge about the Holocaust among the German population, concludes that most adult Germans had access to enough information to understand that Jews were being killed in large numbers in the East, even if the specific details of industrialized death camp operations were not universally known. What they did with that knowledge, the range of responses from active participation to passive accommodation to private anguish to deliberate ignorance, reflects the complex moral landscape of a society under totalitarian governance. It does not support the post-war narrative of innocent unknowing. The Jewish communities of occupied Europe were not passive. This requires emphasis because the dominant visual record of the Holocaust, the photographs from liberation, the images of starving prisoners, the evidence of industrial destruction, can create a false impression of total victimhood that erases the record of resistance. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April to May of 1943 is the most well-known act of armed resistance. Jewish fighters, organized primarily by the Jewish Combat Organization under Mordecai Anielewicz, held the ghetto against a German military force conducting a liquidation operation for approximately 4 weeks, using weapons that had been smuggled into the ghetto at enormous personal cost. The uprising failed in the sense that it did not stop the liquidation of the ghetto. It succeeded in the sense that it was fought, that the Jewish community of Warsaw chose to die fighting rather than to be deported. Uprisings also took place in the Treblinka and Sobibor death camps in 1943. Individual acts of resistance, hiding, false documentation, flight into forests to join partisan units, were practiced at considerable scale across occupied Europe. The Ringelblum archive, buried in containers under the Warsaw Ghetto and partially recovered after the war, represents one of the most important acts of collective resistance. A deliberate effort by the historian Emanuel Ringelblum and his team to document the reality of life and death in the ghetto so that the truth would survive, even if those who recorded it did not. The Holocaust killed approximately 6 million Jews, roughly 2/3 of the pre-war European Jewish population of 9 million. It also killed approximately 220,000 Roma, an estimated 250,000 to 350,000 disabled people who had been murdered in the earlier euthanasia program between 1939 and 1941. Tens of thousands of gay men, hundreds of thousands of Soviet and Polish political prisoners, and millions of Soviet prisoners of war who died of deliberate starvation, exposure, and disease in German captivity. The total number of people killed under the Nazi regime in the concentration camp and death camp system, in mass shootings, and through deliberate starvation of occupied populations, is estimated by scholars at between 11 and 17 million, depending on the categories included. These numbers sit on a page and mean something to the mind, but very little to the emotions, because the human emotional system cannot process them honestly. What it can process are individual stories, the specific names, the individual photographs, the single personal documents that represent a life before the killing. The Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem has collected approximately 4,700,000 names. The project of collecting them is ongoing. They have not all been found. Chapter 12, Turning the Tide, Stalingrad, North Africa, and The Strategic Shift, 1942 to 1943. By the beginning of 1942, the shape of the war had changed fundamentally from what it had been 18 months earlier. The conflict that had begun as a European war between Germany and the Western Allies had become, through the German invasion of the Soviet Union and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a genuinely global war involving the largest economies and military forces on Earth. The strategic question of whether Germany could win this war, which had been genuinely open in the summer of 1940, when Britain stood alone, was not yet definitively answered. But the terms of the answer were becoming clearer. Germany's window of genuine strategic opportunity had been the 18 months between the fall of France and the failure before Moscow. After December of 1941, Germany was fighting a coalition that collectively outproduced it in every category of military materiel. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose. The question, which would cost many millions more lives to answer, was when, and whether the alliance arrayed against it could deliver the military blows required to end the war before Germany's internal collapse did. Germany's summer offensive in the East in 1942, codenamed Case Blue, Fall Blau, reflected a realistic assessment of the changed strategic situation in one sense. It aimed not at Moscow, but at the oil fields of the Caucasus, which were the genuine resource vulnerability that the German war economy could not sustain without. If Germany could seize the Baku oil fields and simultaneously cut the Volga River at Stalingrad, the industrial city on the great eastern bend of the river, named for the Soviet leader through which much of Soviet rail and river traffic moved, it could potentially strangle the Red Army's fuel supply and the southern Soviet economy simultaneously. Stalingrad, and this division of effort was the fundamental operational error that shaped everything that followed. An army group strong enough to achieve either objective might have been too weak to achieve both simultaneously, given the distances involved and the growing capacity of the Red Army to recover and counterattack. The battle for Stalingrad, which began in earnest in August of 1942 and ended with the surrender of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and the remnants of the German Sixth Army on the 2nd of February 1943, was the single most consequential military engagement of the entire Second World War. It was not the largest battle in terms of forces engaged. Some of the great Soviet operations of 1944 would involve more men, but its strategic and psychological consequences exceeded any other single engagement on the Eastern Front. Understanding why requires understanding both what was at stake operationally and what the battle came to mean for both sides as it progressed from a campaign to a symbol. The city itself, stretching roughly 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga, was a significant industrial centre. It produced tractors and, from 1941 onward, tanks, but its operational significance was primarily as a transportation hub and as the hinge of the German southern advance. For Stalin, the city that bore his name could not be surrendered without catastrophic political consequences. For Hitler, its capture became, over the course of the summer, an obsession that progressively displaced rational operational assessment. By September of 1942, the German Sixth Army under Paulus was fighting its way through the rubble of the city in a form of combat, close quarters, building by building, for which the Wehrmacht's training and doctrine were less well suited than the Red Army's. The Soviet defenders, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize German operational advantages, fighting at such close range that German artillery and air support could not be used without killing German soldiers. The hugging tactic, keeping German and Soviet forces so close together that the gap between them was measured in meters, turned the battle into something that German operational doctrine had no good answer for. While the battle consumed the Sixth Army's attention and resources, Soviet operational planning at the front and in Moscow was preparing a response of a different kind. Operation Uranus, launched on the 19th of November, 1942, struck not the Sixth Army in the city, but at the flanks of the German salient, which were held by Romanian and Italian armies that were less well equipped and less deeply dug in than their German counterparts. Within 4 days, the two arms of the Soviet pincer movement had met at the town of Kalach, and the German Sixth Army, approximately 290,000 men, was surrounded. Hitler forbade Paulus to attempt to break out, insisting that the Sixth Army hold its positions and be resupplied by air. Hermann Göring's assurance that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army was not operationally credible given the tonnage required and the weather conditions, but it provided Hitler with the argument he needed to justify the decision he had already made. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, came within roughly 50 kilometers of the encirclement perimeter in December before being halted by Soviet counteraction. Paulus refused to attempt to break out to meet it, following his orders. The last German supply flights into the pocket landed in mid-January of 1943. The remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered on the 2nd of February, 1943. Paulus himself had been promoted to Field Marshal on the same day, in what was apparently intended as an inducement to suicide, rather than surrender, since no German Field Marshal had previously surrendered to an enemy. The psychological impact across Germany was unlike anything the home front had experienced previously. The propaganda ministry under Goebbels, which had been carefully managing domestic information about the battle throughout its course, proclaimed 3 days of national mourning. The defeat was acknowledged, which was itself unusual. German military setbacks had typically been explained away or described as strategic redeployments. The acknowledgement of Stalingrad reflected a calculation that the scale of the disaster made denial impossible, and that controlled acknowledgement was more useful than a lie that could not hold. Goebbels' speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin on the 18th of February, 1943. The speech in which he asked his audience of carefully selected party members whether they wanted total war and receive the roaring affirmation he had staged, represents the Nazi propaganda apparatus at the height of its manipulation of genuine emotion. The Germans in that hall were afraid. Goebbels gave their fear a shape and a direction that served the regime's purposes. The North African campaign, which had begun in September of 1940, when Italian forces under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani advanced from Libya into Egypt and had oscillated back and forth across the Libyan-Egyptian frontier for 2 years, reached its decisive phase in the autumn of 1942. General Bernard Montgomery's Eighth Army, reinforced and resupplied through Malta at enormous cost, attacked the German-Italian position at El Alamein on the 23rd of October, 1942. The Battle of El Alamein, the second of 3 engagements around that position, lasted 11 days and ended with the breakthrough of the Axis defensive line and the beginning of a westward pursuit that would not end until Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was driven from North Africa entirely. On the 8th of November 1942, just as the fighting at El Alamein was ending, and 3 days before Operation Uranus began, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, the first large-scale Anglo-American amphibious operation of the war. Rommel was now caught between 2 Allied forces advancing from opposite directions. The Axis bridgehead in Tunisia, into which Hitler poured substantial reinforcements in a characteristic refusal to accept a strategic withdrawal, held until May of 1943, when approximately 250,000 Axis troops surrendered, a defeat in scale comparable to Stalingrad, and coming only 3 months afterward. The summer of 1943 brought the last major German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel, Unternehmen Zitadelle, aimed at eliminating the Soviet salient around Kursk through a double envelopment. The Kursk salient, a westward bulge in the front roughly 190 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep, was the obvious target for such an operation, which was why the Red Army had 6 months to prepare for it. The Soviet intelligence service, with assistance from sources in Western intelligence networks, knew the German operation was coming. The Red Army constructed a defensive system of extraordinary depth. 6 defensive belts extending roughly 175 kilometers, containing hundreds of thousands of mines, thousands of artillery pieces, and extensive anti-tank fortifications, specifically designed to absorb the German armored offensive and destroy its momentum. The battle that began on the 5th of July, 1943, was the largest armored engagement in history in terms of forces committed, though the precise tank numbers involved at specific engagements like Prokhorovka on the 12th of July remain debated by historians, and the figure of 1,200 tanks clashing in a single field that appears in popular accounts has been substantially revised downward by post-Soviet archival research. Operation Citadel was called off by Hitler on the 13th of July, 1943, 8 days after it began, partly because the Allied landings in Sicily on the 10th of July created demands for forces to be redeployed to Italy, and partly because the northern pincer under Field Marshal Walter Model had made very limited progress against the Soviet defenses. The German offensive capacity in the east was, after Kursk, functionally exhausted. The Wehrmacht could still conduct skillful defensive operations and limited counterattacks. It could not again mount the kind of large-scale offensive that had characterized German operations in 1941 and 1942. From the summer of 1943 onward, strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Red Army. The subsequent history of the war in the East is the story of a Soviet advance, halting at times, catastrophically costly in human terms, but directionally consistent, westward toward Germany. What 1942 and 1943 established, taken together, was a strategic reality that most of the German military leadership understood and that Hitler refused to acknowledge. The war was lost, not immediately, not without enormous remaining costs in lives on all sides, but the outcome was determined. The Allied coalition, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the Commonwealth, collectively outproduced Germany in every category. American industrial output alone was, by 1943, producing more aircraft, more ships, more tanks, and more ammunition than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The German war economy, which had operated with surprising inefficiency in the early war years because of competing bureaucratic fiefdoms and Hitler's resistance to total economic mobilization, was being reorganized under Albert Speer's ministry. Armaments production increased significantly in 1942 and 1943. But reorganization was not enough to change the fundamental arithmetic. Germany was an island of production, surrounded by an ocean of industrial capacity that it could not reach and could not match. Chapter 13: The German Resistance and the Last Conspiracies, 1938 to 1944. History tends to remember the Third Reich as a monolith, a system of total control in which opposition was impossible and in which anyone capable of resistance was either dead, imprisoned, or silent. This is not quite accurate, and correcting it matters not merely as a historical footnote, but because the story of resistance within Germany tells us something important about the nature of totalitarian systems and about the costs that meaningful opposition to them requires. There was a German resistance. It was not large. It was not, in the end, effective in achieving its primary objective, but it existed, and the men and women who composed it operated under conditions of danger that make most other forms of political opposition look comfortable by comparison. This chapter is their story, and also an honest accounting of the limitations, contradictions, and failures that prevented their efforts from succeeding. The resistance within Germany to the Nazi regime was not a unified movement. It was a collection of overlapping networks: military officers, diplomats, former politicians, trade unionists, clergy, students, who shared a general opposition to Hitler, but frequently disagreed about goals, methods, timing, and the nature of the Germany they hoped to build after a successful removal of the regime. Some resistors were conservatives who had supported or accommodated the Nazi rise to power in the early 1930s, and who turned against the regime only when its aggressive foreign policy threatened to destroy Germany. Others were social democrats or communists who had opposed the Nazis from the beginning, but whose networks had been effectively destroyed by the Gestapo in the mid-1930s. Some were motivated primarily by military judgment, the conviction that Hitler was leading Germany to catastrophic defeat. Others were motivated by moral revulsion at what the regime was doing to Jews, to occupied populations, to Germany's own institutions. The earliest organized resistance within the military coalesced around the figure of General Ludwig Beck, the chief of the German General Staff, who resigned his position in August of 1938 over his opposition to Hitler's plans to attack Czechoslovakia, which he believed would trigger a general European war that Germany could not win. Beck became the center of a conspiracy that, in September of 1938, planned to arrest Hitler if he ordered the invasion of Czechoslovakia and to use the coup as the basis for a negotiated settlement with the Western powers. The conspiracy involved a significant number of senior officers, including General Franz Halder, who replaced Beck as chief of the General Staff, and General Erwin von Witzleben, who commanded the forces in the Berlin area that would have been essential to any coup attempt. The conspiracy did not proceed, and its failure was directly connected to Munich, when Chamberlain flew to Germany and returned with an agreement satisfying Hitler's stated demands without war. The military pretext for the coup, that Hitler was driving Germany into an unwinnable conflict, was removed. Munich did not merely appease Hitler, it demolished the internal military resistance, most available justification for action. The resistance continued through the early war years, sustained by a network of remarkable individuals who risked, and many of whom eventually paid, their lives. The Kreisachel Circle centered on the estate of Count Helmuth James von Moltke in Silesia, brought together a group of approximately 25 to 30 people: military officers, lawyers, civil servants, Protestant and Catholic clergy, who met to discuss the nature of the post-Nazi Germany they wished to construct. Their discussions covered constitutional arrangements, federalism, economic organization, and the role of Christianity in public life. They were not primarily a group of active plotters. Von Moltke himself was opposed to assassination on moral grounds, but a group of thinkers preparing for a political transformation they believed was coming. Von Moltke was arrested by the Gestapo in January of 1944 on charges unrelated to the conspiracy that later bore his name, and was executed in January of 1945. The assassination attempt that came closest to success, and that has defined public memory of the German resistance more than any other event, was the bomb plot of the 20th of July, 1944. The central organizer of the attempt was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a highly decorated staff officer who had lost his right hand, 2 fingers of his left hand, and his left eye in Tunisia in April of 1943, and who had become, after his wounds, the most energetic and organizationally capable figure in the military conspiracy. Stauffenberg was connected to a network of conspirators, including General Friedrich Olbricht, General Henning von Treschow, Karl Gordeler, and Beck, who had been planning a coup attempt through the later months of 1943 and into 1944. The plan, codenamed Operation Valkyrie, used the existing Wehrmacht Reserve Army mobilization plan, a contingency designed for suppressing a potential uprising by the millions of foreign workers in Germany, as the administrative framework for a military takeover. Stauffenberg was in the unusual position of being one of the few people in the conspiracy who had both the operational access to Hitler necessary to place a bomb and the operational role in the subsequent coup that required his presence in Berlin. On the 20th of July, 1944, Stauffenberg flew from Berlin to Hitler's military headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia, the Wolf Schanzen, the Wolf's Lair, carrying a briefcase containing 2 explosive charges. Under time pressure, he had less than 10 minutes alone to arm the bombs. He managed to arm only one of the 2 charges before being interrupted. He placed the briefcase under the map table in the conference room, where Hitler was conducting a midday military briefing, and left the room on a pretext. The bomb detonated at 12:42 in the afternoon. The blast killed 4 people and injured several others. Hitler survived, partly because the conference had been moved from its usual underground bunker to a surface building, with less blast containment on that particular day due to the summer heat, and partly because the briefcase had been inadvertently moved to the far side of a heavy table support by another officer who found it in his way. Stauffenberg, watching from outside and seeing the building destroyed by the blast, concluded that Hitler was dead and flew immediately back to Berlin to coordinate the coup. What followed in Berlin through the afternoon and evening of the 20th of July was a sequence of catastrophic command failures that doomed the conspiracy. The communications procedures, which should have triggered immediate decisive action the moment Stauffenberg's aircraft departed Rastenburg, were not initiated with the speed required. General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the Reserve Army, whose cooperation was essential for Valkyrie to work, refused to commit to the conspiracy when he could not confirm Hitler's death. The signals center in the Bendler block, the Wehrmacht headquarters building in Berlin, where Stauffenberg landed, and from which the coup was to be coordinated, was not seized quickly enough. Word that Hitler had survived reached Berlin while the coup was still unfolding, and the conspirators could not agree on how to proceed. By late evening, loyal SS and Wehrmacht units had regained control of the Bendler block. Stauffenberg, Beck, Olbricht, and several others were arrested and executed in the courtyard of the Bendler block in the early hours of the 21st of July. Beck, wounded in an attempted suicide, was finished by a soldier on Fromm's orders. Hitler's survival of the bomb plot unleashed a wave of repression that destroyed what remained of organized military resistance in Germany. The Gestapo investigation, which cast a net across the military and civilian establishment and lasted for months, eventually resulted in the arrest of approximately 7,000 people, of whom roughly 4,900 were executed, many of them after show trials before the People's Court under the sadistic presiding judge Roland Freisler, where the accused were deliberately humiliated, denied proper legal representation, and sentenced to death by slow hanging with piano wire. The widows and families of the conspirators were arrested under the policy of Sippenhaft, kin liability, which the Nazi leadership applied to make resistance more personally costly by extending punishment to anyone connected to the accused by blood or marriage. Stauffenberg's wife Nina was arrested, their children taken into state custody under false names. She survived. Most of the children were eventually located after the war. The failure of the 20th of July and the subsequent destruction of resistance networks raises a question that is asked repeatedly and answered differently by different historians. Could the German resistance have succeeded? The honest answer is probably not, given the specific structural conditions of the Third Reich in its final years. The regime's internal security apparatus was too comprehensive, the culture of the oath and military obedience too deeply embedded, and the network of regime loyalists in key positions too complete for a military coup to move with the speed that success required. But the question of success may not be the only frame through which to evaluate the resistance. The men and women who resisted did so knowing the near certainty of failure. Some of them were motivated by the moral imperative of witness, of demonstrating that not all Germans accepted what was being done in Germany's name. Count von Moltke, in his final letter before his execution, wrote that he was dying not for any particular political goal, but to demonstrate that there remained people in Germany for whom Christian and moral principles were not negotiable. Whether one shares his theology or not, the statement deserves to be read as something more than a convenient martyrdom narrative. It was a considered position, held under conditions that tested it completely. The German resistance has been debated in terms of its motivations, its membership, and its political character since the immediate post-war period, when questions about who had resisted and on what grounds carried significant weight for the construction of the post-war German state and identity. Some of the military resistors had, earlier in their careers, collaborated with or accommodated aspects of the Nazi regime. Several had served in operations in which war crimes were committed. The resistance of the 20th of July was not a resistance of people with clean hands, and the attempt by post-war West German political culture to construct it as an uncomplicated heroic narrative obscured the moral complexity that the historical record preserves. The complexity does not diminish the courage. It contextualizes it honestly. Chapter 14, The Beginning of the ND-Day, The Liberation of Europe and the Collapse of the Eastern Front, 1944 to 1945. By the beginning of 1944, the military leadership of every major combatant nation understood that the war's outcome was no longer in question. What remained was a set of questions about timing, geography, and cost. Questions that would be answered in blood across the following 18 months, on three major fronts simultaneously. The Red Army, supplied in part by American Lend-Lease equipment and backed by a Soviet defense industrial complex that had recovered from the catastrophic losses of 1941 and was now producing more tanks and artillery than Germany and all its remaining allies combined, was pressing westward against a Wehrmacht that could resist skillfully but could no longer replace its losses. The Anglo-American forces had cleared North Africa, invaded Sicily in July of 1943, and were grinding slowly northward up the Italian peninsula against skilled German defensive fighting in terrain that heavily favoured defence. And in England, the largest amphibious operation in history was being assembled with a deliberateness and logistical sophistication that reflected the degree to which the Allies had learned from the costly failures of earlier amphibious operations. The planning for the cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord, had been underway since the Quebec Conference of August of 1943, where the date and broad concept were confirmed between Churchill and Roosevelt. Operational command fell to General Dwight Eisenhower, whose particular genius was not battlefield tactics but alliance management, coordinating the genuinely difficult personalities, national interests, and institutional cultures of the American, British, Canadian, and various Allied in exile military commands into a functional combined operation was a feat of organizational leadership that has perhaps not been adequately appreciated alongside the tactical and strategic dimensions of the campaign. The Deception Plan, Operation Bodyguard, of which the specific subplan Fortitude was the most operationally significant, worked with remarkable thoroughness to convince the German High Command that the main Allied landing would come at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest channel crossing, rather than in Normandy. A fictional army group commanded on paper by General George Patton, whose reputation the Germans respected more than Eisenhower's, was constructed in southeast England with signals traffic, dummy equipment, and double agents feeding the German intelligence system precisely what the Allied planners wanted them to see. On the 6th of June 1944, the day that has compressed itself in historical memory into the single-syllable D-Day, the largest naval armada ever assembled crossed the English Channel in darkness. 156,000 troops landed on 5 beaches along a roughly 80-kilometre stretch of the Normandy coast in the first 24 hours. 3 airborne divisions, 2 American, 1 British, dropped behind the beaches in the early hours of the morning to secure the flanks of the landing areas. The naval bombardment that preceded the landings was of a scale that, on some beaches, was decisive in suppressing German defensive fire during the critical period of the initial assault. On others, most catastrophically at the American sector, designated Omaha Beach, where terrain, defenders, and the loss of most of the specialized swimming tanks in the rough seas combined to create a morning of extraordinary casualties among the first waves. The bombardment was not enough, and what followed required extraordinary individual and unit courage to survive and advance. The battle for Normandy that followed the landings lasted approximately 77 days, from the 6th of June to the 21st of August, when the German forces in the Falaise pocket, caught between British, Canadian, and Polish forces pressing from the north and American forces swinging south and east, were destroyed as a coherent fighting force. The Normandy campaign was not a smooth or continuous advance. The bocage country, the dense hedgerow landscape of interior Normandy, proved ideally suited to German defensive tactics, and Allied progress was frequently measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. The fighting at places like Caen, which Montgomery had suggested, would fall on D-Day itself, but which required weeks of attritional combat and multiple major operations to secure, generated significant tension between British and American commanders about the pace and direction of the campaign. But the strategic logic held. The German army in Normandy was being used up, its reserves committed to the Normandy front, its ability to respond to the eventual American breakout operation, Operation Cobra, which began on the 25th of July, progressively degraded by a campaign of sustained air and ground pressure that the Wehrmacht simply could not sustain. The liberation of Paris on the 25th of August, 1944. The French 2nd Armoured Division entering the city first, as had been specifically arranged to give France the symbolic honour of liberating its own capital, and the subsequent Allied advance through Belgium and into the Netherlands produced a brief period of almost intoxicating optimism in Allied headquarters that the war might be over before Christmas. This optimism, though understandable given the pace of the German collapse in August and September, was premature. The Allied logistical system, stretched beyond its capacity by the speed of the advance, could not simultaneously supply the multiple army groups pursuing the Germans across France. The debate between Eisenhower's broad front strategy and Montgomery's proposal for a concentrated single thrust into Germany was not merely a clash of personalities. It reflected a genuine operational dilemma about whether concentrated resources could break through German defenses before the German army recovered its coherence. The German army demonstrated, in the autumn of 1944, a capacity for defensive resilience that had not been fully anticipated. The West Wall, the defensive fortifications along Germany's western border, provided a framework around which German forces that had appeared broken in August reconstituted themselves. American forces attempting to breach the West Wall at Aachen and in the Hürtgen Forest experienced fighting of a severity and cost that the optimism of late August had not suggested was still possible. Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, the ambitious attempt in September of 1944 to use 3 airborne divisions to capture the bridges across the major Dutch rivers and outflank the West Wall entirely, failed at its last objective, the bridge at Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division found itself fighting a far stronger German force than intelligence had indicated, and was eventually destroyed as a formation after 9 days of extraordinarily costly fighting. On the Eastern Front, 1944 saw the Red Army conduct a series of offensive operations that, in operational scope and speed, matched and in some cases exceeded the great German operations of 1941 and 42. Operation Bagration, launched on the 23rd of June, 1944, the 3rd anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, destroyed Army Group Center in a 2-month campaign that cost Germany approximately 400,000 men in killed, wounded, and prisoner. The simultaneity of Bagration and the Normandy campaign imposed demands on German strategic reserves that the Wehrmacht could not meet on either front. By the autumn of 1944, the Red Army stood on the Vistula, having advanced approximately 500 kilometers in 2 months. Soviet forces had reached the borders of East Prussia. Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland had exited the war as German allies. German forces in the Baltic states were cut off and effectively irrelevant to the defense of the Reich's core. Hitler's decision to launch a major counteroffensive in the West in December of 1944. Operation Watch on the Rhine, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, known in the West as the Battle of the Bulge, was presented to his commanders as a potential war-winning stroke. A concentrated armoured attack through the Ardennes, aimed at Antwerp, that would split the Allied armies and potentially force a political crisis in the coalition. Most of his senior commanders believed the goal was operationally unachievable given the available resources, but they executed the plan with whatever professional skill remained. The offensive, launched on the 16th of December, achieved genuine initial surprise. Allied intelligence had badly underestimated the German capacity to reconstitute armoured forces in the West, and made significant progress in the first days. But it was stopped, eventually reversed, and by mid-January of 1945 had been pushed back largely to its starting positions. at a cost in German armored equipment and trained manpower that Germany had no capacity to replace. The Ardennes Offensive was the last German strategic initiative of the war. What came after it was only defense and retreat. The final chapter of the military campaign, the crossing of the Rhine by Allied forces, beginning in March of 1945. The Soviet winter offensive that began on the 12th of January and carried the Red Army from the Vistula to within roughly 60 kilometers of Berlin by early February, was a story of a state that had lost the war, continuing to fight, with a determination that cost its own people as much as it cost its enemies. The enforcement of continued resistance by the SS and the Nazi Party apparatus. Men were hanged from lampposts for defeatism in German towns and cities as late as April of 1945, represented the regime turning its coercive machinery on the German population itself, making the civilian cost of ending the war by anything other than complete Allied conquest prohibitive. This final period, in which Germany's own people were subjected to the full weight of the system's capacity for violence, is one of the least discussed aspects of the Third Reich's final months, and it deserves to be understood as what it was: a regime that had consumed the people it claimed to represent. Chapter 15, The Reckoning, The End of the Reich, Nuremberg, and the World Remade, 1945 and after. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over historical narratives at their end, and it is important to resist it here. The temptation, having traced the arc of the Third Reich across 12 years and 15 chapters, is to conclude with a sense of completion, of a story that ends neatly, its catastrophe accounted for, its perpetrators punished, its lessons extracted and filed. The history does not cooperate with that. What the end of the Third Reich produced was not resolution, but a new set of questions, some of which remain unresolved 80 years later. This final chapter is about endings and about what they did not, in fact, end. The physical destruction of Germany in the final months of the war was of a scale that is difficult to convey in descriptive language. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, British Bomber Command attacking at night, the American 8th Air Force by day, had been operating against German cities since the early years of the war and had reached its maximum intensity in the final year. The destruction of Dresden on the 13th and 14th of February 1945, in raids that killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people. According to the most careful historical estimates, a figure considerably lower than the numbers that entered popular myth, became the most debated single episode of the Allied bombing campaign, raising questions about targeting philosophy and proportionality that have not been definitively settled. The total death toll of the strategic bombing campaign in Germany is estimated at approximately 350,000 to 500,000 civilian dead. The physical destruction of German cities, roughly a quarter of all housing stock in major urban areas, was extensive enough to make the question of rebuilding Germany after the war one of the most daunting logistical challenges of the post-war era. The Soviet advance into Germany's eastern territories, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, in the winter and spring of 1945, was accompanied by a wave of atrocities against the German civilian population that reflected, in part, the accumulated rage of a Soviet army that had passed through German-occupied Soviet territory and had seen what the German occupation had done there. The sexual violence against German women during the Soviet advance was of a scale that German historiography struggled to acknowledge for decades. The subject remained largely suppressed in East Germany and inadequately addressed in West Germany until the late 1980s and beyond, when a new generation of historians began to confront the full human cost of the Eastern War's final phase. This is part of the historical record, and including it is not a form of moral equivalence between perpetrator and victim nations. It is an acknowledgement that the total war the Third Reich had initiated produced total suffering, and that the suffering did not sort itself neatly by the political categories of aggressor and defender. Berlin was encircled by Soviet forces in the final weeks of April of 1945. The fighting in the city, street by street, building by building, in a scene of ruins that the years of bombing and the battle itself had produced, lasted from approximately the 16th of April until the 2nd of May. Approximately 360,000 soldiers died in the Battle of Berlin, a city of perhaps 2 million remaining civilians sheltering in cellars and underground stations. Adolf Hitler, who had remained in the Berlin bunker, the Führer bunker, a complex of rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, since January of 1945, conducting an increasingly disconnected version of military command as the fronts contracted around the city, married his companion Eva Braun on the 29th of April, 1945. On the afternoon of the 30th of April, with Soviet forces approximately 300 to 500 meters from the bunker entrance, he took his own life. Eva Braun died alongside him. Their bodies were burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden, in accordance with instructions Hitler had given, so that his remains would not be captured and displayed as Soviet war trophies. The fate he had watched befell Mussolini's body after Italian partisans killed him 2 days earlier. The formal surrender of Germany was signed in the early hours of the 7th of May, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, and again the following day in a Soviet-insisted ceremony in Berlin, with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signing for the German military before Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The 8th of May became Victory in Europe Day, though the Soviet Union celebrated it on the 9th, when the Berlin signing ceremony was complete. The war in Europe, the war that had consumed approximately 27 million Soviet lives, approximately 6 million Jewish lives, perhaps 5.5 million Polish lives, roughly 5.5 million German military lives, hundreds of thousands of British and Commonwealth lives, and more than 400,000 American lives, was over. The scale of the killing, summarized in those sentences, resists absorption into any single emotional response. The Nuremberg trials, the International Military Tribunal, which convened its first session on the 20th of November, 1945, and delivered its verdicts on the 1st of October, 1946, were the first attempt in history to hold state leaders legally accountable for crimes of aggressive war, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity in an international court. 22 senior Nazi defendants were tried by a panel of judges representing the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. 12 were sentenced to death, 3 to life imprisonment, 4 to lengthy prison terms, 3 were acquitted. The trials produced an enormously important documentary record. The prosecution gathered hundreds of thousands of documents from captured German archives, many of which might otherwise have been lost or destroyed, and established the legal principle of individual responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity that would eventually inform the development of international criminal law, the Rome Statute, and the International Criminal Court. The Nuremberg process was also, from the beginning, contested on both legal and political grounds. Defense lawyers argued that the charges of crimes against peace were ex post facto law, that aggressive war had not been clearly defined as a crime under international law at the time it was conducted. Soviet participation in the tribunal was complicated by the Soviet Union's own acts. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Katyn massacre of Polish officers in 1940, the invasion of Finland, that could have been characterized under the same legal standards as the acts being prosecuted. These objections were raised at the time, and have continued to be raised in the scholarship since. They are real objections that deserve acknowledgement rather than dismissal. They do not invalidate the core achievement of Nuremberg, which was the establishment that political and military leaders could be held personally accountable under law for the acts of states, a principle that changed the architecture of international law permanently, even if its application has been inconsistent in the 8 decades since. The denazification process, the attempt by Allied occupation authorities to identify, remove, and in some cases prosecute those who had participated in the Nazi regime, was, in retrospect, a large and partially successful administrative effort that was compromised by the sheer scale of what it attempted, by the urgency of post-war reconstruction, and by the emerging Cold War, which created pressures to rehabilitate former Nazis whose skills, cooperation, or intelligence value were deemed useful by the Western powers. The program of Operation Paperclip, through which the United States recruited German scientists, including a number with direct connections to concentration camp forced labor programs, reflects the degree to which the operational demands of the Cold War competed with the moral demands of denazification almost immediately after the war's end. The West German state that emerged from the occupation in 1949 inherited, in its judiciary and civil service, a significant number of people who had served the Third Reich in various capacities, and who continued to serve the new state with their careers largely uninterrupted. This is documented. It is uncomfortable. And the political and cultural processing of this inheritance occupied West German society, and continues to occupy German society for generations. What the 12 years of the Third Reich left behind was not simply a set of historical events to be catalogued and understood. It left behind a set of moral and political problems that the post-war world has been working through ever since. The problem of genocide and the legal mechanisms for preventing and punishing it. The problem of how democratic institutions can be made more resistant to the specific vulnerabilities that Weimar exposed. The problem of individual moral responsibility within systems of organized evil. The problem of historical memory and the obligations of subsequent generations toward events they did not participate in, but inherited. And the problem, perhaps the most difficult of all, of how to understand human beings capable of producing both the cultural achievements of Weimar and the industrial murder of Auschwitz within the span of 2 decades and within the same national culture. There are no clean conclusions here. The Third Reich was not an aberration in the sense of being impossible to understand or incapable of historical explanation. Every step of its construction, the economic conditions, the political fragility, the ideological currents, the specific decisions of specific individuals, can be traced, analyzed, and in retrospect criticized. But explanation is not the same as prevention. The conditions that produced the Third Reich were specific to Germany in the 1920s and 30s, but the mechanisms, the exploitation of economic fear, the construction of external enemies, the destruction of institutional constraints on executive power, the normalization of exceptional measures through legal forms, are not specific to any time or place. They are patterns in political behavior that appear in different forms, in different contexts. And recognizing them requires precisely the kind of careful, patient, frictionful engagement with historical evidence that this documentary has attempted across 15 chapters and 4 hours. The 8.5 million members of the NSDAP, the men and women who carried their party books through 12 years of the Reich, were not all zealots. Most of them were ordinary people who made a series of accommodations, large and small, that collectively produced an outcome none of them could have individually prevented, but all of them collectively enabled. The soldiers who fought in the Wehrmacht were not all perpetrators of atrocities. but they fought for a regime that committed atrocities as policy. The civil servants who processed the deportation paperwork were not all anti-Semites, but they processed the paperwork. The neighbors who reported the Jewish family next door to the Gestapo were not all motivated by hatred. Some were motivated by the wish to acquire that family's apartment. The ordinariness of the participation is the most difficult thing to sit with, because it places the history in a moral proximity to ordinary human experience that the mythology of monstrous exceptionalism allows us to avoid. We come to the end of this documentary with the names we began it with. The 6 million, plus the millions more, plus the tens of millions who died in the war. Their persecution and murder was embedded within. They do not belong to history in the sense of being contained by it, explained by it, filed and closed. The project of accounting for them, of naming them, of understanding the system that killed them, of building the institutional and moral architecture that might prevent repetition, is not complete. The Yad Vashem database grows with each year as more names are recovered from obscurity. The International Tracing Service archives, now fully open to researchers, continue to yield individual stories that the summary statistics cannot contain. This documentary has been built from archival evidence, from the historiographical work of scholars who have spent their professional lives in these records, and from a commitment to treating you, the person watching this, at whatever hour and in whatever state of mind, as someone capable of holding complexity without flinching. The history of the Third Reich is the hardest history in the modern era to engage with honestly, precisely because it sits at the intersection of everything important: power and its abuses, the fragility of democratic institutions, the capacity of ordinary people for both extraordinary courage and extraordinary compliance, and the question of what we owe to those who came before us and those who will come after. If you have reached this point, all 4 hours, all 15 chapters, then you have done something that very few people do with this material. You have sat with it. You have not looked away. That matters. Not because watching a documentary constitutes activism or penance or memorial, but because understanding is the precondition for everything else. You cannot build the institutional safeguards you have not diagnosed the need for. You cannot recognize the pattern you have not studied. And you cannot honor the memory of the dead by refusing to look at how they died and why. Share this documentary with someone who needs to understand. Leave a comment with the specific moment in these 4 hours that made you stop and think. Subscribe if you want to continue this kind of work. Long form, sourced, frictionful history that treats the past as what it actually was. Not a lesson neatly packaged, but a record, incomplete and demanding, that has something essential to say to us, right now, about who we are and what we are capable of. The archive is open. The records are waiting. We owe them the honesty of reading carefully.